Good evening. Tonight we will drift into a world long vanished, where the echoes of colossal creatures still resound among vast plains and dense forests. As the sun sets over forgotten landscapes, we shall wander through the silent whispers of the late Mesozoic, feeling the breath of ancient winds and the scent of primeval waters. If you find this journey enthralling, do subscribe and leave a like so that these lost echoes may continue to be heard. Now, let us step quietly into the realm of the giants and listen to the world as it once was. The land stretched far and wide, a tapestry of muted greens and browns that quivered under the relentless sweep of the wind. Hills rose in gentle undulations, their slopes dotted with clusters of gnarled trees, their trunks thick and furrowed, bark etched with the slow, patient hand of time. In the distance, a low haze shimmered above the surface of the marshlands, mingling with the faint vapours of the morning mist that still lingered from the receding night. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and rotting foliage, interwoven with the subtle sweetness of flowering cycads and the tang of resin exuded by ancient conifers. Here and there, the glassy sheen of water reflected the sky, disturbed only by the slow ripple of creatures moving beneath the surface or the occasional dip of a giant herbivore bending to drink. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in a muted haze, casting elongated shadows across the uneven terrain. The illumination was neither harsh nor bright, but softened by the persistent dust and pollen that floated in the atmosphere, particles catching the light in a pale golden shimmer. The sounds of the land were a constant, understated presence, a distant roar of water tumbling over rocks, the rustle of leaves as the wind passed through them, the low resonant calls of creatures too vast and distant to be seen. Every sound seemed amplified by the sheer expanse of open land, yet softened by the dense vegetation that absorbed and muted each note. Amidst the vastness, the giants moved with a ponderous grace. Their massive forms, silhouetted against the distant horizon, seemed almost mythic, the slow sway of their necks and the deliberate movement of their limbs evoking both power and fragility. The ground itself seemed to respond to their passage, quivering imperceptibly under the weight of those titanic bodies. Each footfall left deep impressions in the loamy soil, marks that would remain long after the creature had passed, etched into the memory of the land. In their wake, smaller creatures stirred, birds and lizards scuttled away from the shadowed areas, insects lifted into the air and tiny mammals crouched in concealed burrows, sensing the tremors of existence above. The climate, once balmy and stable, had begun to shift. The heat of the day rose in waves radiating from parched plains and shallow riverbeds, while cooler air trickled down from the distant highlands. Storms were rare but decisive, and their sudden appearance could transform a placid landscape into a tempestuous theatre of water and wind. Clouds, dark and rolling, gathered over the horizon, and the distant thunder spoke of the immense forces at work in a world still young and untamed. Lightning arced across the sky, illuminating for brief instants the delicate details of foliage and the powerful musculature of creatures grazing or drinking, reminding the observer that even in this age of giants, the natural world held dominion over all. Marshes in particular were places of hidden drama. The murky waters were home to a multitude of life forms, many unseen but felt through subtle signs, a ripple here, a shadow there, a disturbance in the reeds. Frogs and small reptiles thrived in the damp soil, insects laid eggs among the muck, and the occasional fish broke the surface, sending concentric waves outward. Predators, silent and watchful, waited among the vegetation, their eyes reflecting the dim light, muscles coiled for the briefest of strikes. Survival was a constant negotiation, a delicate balance between hunger and caution, and every organism, from the tiniest insect to the colossal herbivore, played a role in the unfolding drama of existence. Forests offered a different kind of theatre. Towering conifers and cycads formed dense groves, the air rich with the scent of resin and decay. Shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy in fleeting glimpses, illuminating patches of fern-covered ground and the occasional fallen log. The subtle sounds of life were everywhere, branches creaking under the weight of a passing creature, the flutter of wings, the faint grinding of plant matter as herbivores fed. The giant sauropods moved through these forests with careful deliberation, their enormous tails swinging in measured arcs to maintain balance, their heads reaching high into the canopy to strip leaves and branchlets. In such a world, every motion carried consequence, every sound was a signal, and the passage of time felt both immense and compressed. Watercourses, winding like silver ribbons through the land, were lifelines in a changing world. Rivers and streams provided sustenance, routes of travel, and places of congregation for myriad species. Along their banks, reeds and sedges grew thick, and the earth bore the unmistakable marks of hooves, claws, and feet of countless generations. Creatures of every size came to drink, to bathe, to hunt, or to hide, and the slow rhythm of these gatherings punctuated the otherwise relentless continuity of survival. Fish glided beneath the surface, occasionally startled by the intrusion of a wading predator or the brush of a massive tail, and amphibians and reptiles made their homes in the nooks and hollows created by shifting waters. Amid the vast plains, the air carried scents of both decay and renewal. Decomposing plant matter lent a rich, pungent aroma to the earth, while newly sprouted ferns, cycads, and conifers offered their subtle fragrances. Fires, natural and periodic, left behind charred remnants that nourished the soil with nutrients, prompting new growth in the seasons that followed. Insects swarmed around these fertile areas, and small vertebrates found refuge in the protective cover of regrowth. The giants themselves, aware of these cycles, moved accordingly, seeking fresh foliage and open water, their movements seemingly dictated by the rhythms of the environment rather than any conscious intent. The passage of seasons was gentle but inexorable. Winters were cooler, bringing frost to exposed areas, while summers pressed down with unyielding heat. Rain came in bursts, sometimes drenching, sometimes light, each affecting the land in subtle and profound ways. The behavior of creatures shifted with the seasons. Nesting, migration, feeding, and resting were all responses to the environment, a choreography as ancient as the world itself. Observing these patterns, one could sense the interplay of forces that governed life long before the rise of humankind, the delicate balances that allowed ecosystems to persist, and the looming pressures that would one day render these giants extinct. Predators, ever vigilant, shaped the lives of herbivores. The stealthy approaches of theropods and other carnivorous giants were measured, patient, and precise. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the faint tremor of the earth beneath large feet, all were signals that prey had learned to read. Survival required not only strength but awareness, and creatures developed habits and strategies over countless generations. Every encounter, whether successful or failed, left impressions on the land, echoes that would persist long after the individual had passed. Nightfall brought a different sensibility to the world. Shadows deepened and the air grew cooler. The sounds of the day gave way to subtler noises, the soft plopping of water, the chirping of nocturnal insects, the distant calls of creatures communicating in low, resonant tones. Moonlight, pale and diffused, painted the landscape in shades of silver and grey, illuminating silhouettes of trees, watercourses, and giants alike. The land in these hours felt ancient and eternal, a living chronicle of time's slow passage, where every leaf, ripple, and footprint told a story. And yet, beneath this tranquil surface, changes were occurring. Volcanoes, distant and unseen, sent ash and smoke into the upper atmosphere. Earthquakes, subtle and rare, shifted land and water, altering habitats and challenging the resilience of all life. Climate shifted gradually, bringing longer dry periods and unpredictable storms. Plants and animals adapted as best they could, some thriving, others diminishing, but all participating in a story that was larger than any individual life. The giants, vast and imposing, were not immune to these pressures. Their survival demanded adaptation, fortitude, and an unyielding response to forces beyond their control. It was in these moments, the quiet movement of a massive creature across a sunlit plain, the reflective stillness of a pond, the subtle sway of ferns in the wind, that the true essence of the late Mesozoic could be felt. Time seemed to slow, attention narrowed to the tactile and the immediate, to smells, sounds, and motions that modern observers might scarcely imagine. Every element was interwoven, forming a complex living tapestry where the fate of one species could ripple through the lives of countless others. In these lost landscapes, the past and present intertwined. The shadows of the giants stretched long across the plains, echoing not only their physical presence but their enduring impact on the ecosystems that surrounded them. They moved with dignity, awareness, and an instinct honed over millions of years, each step a testament to the intricate balance of life. The forests, rivers, and marshes were more than mere settings. They were active participants in the story, shaping and being shaped by the creatures within them. As the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, the world seemed to hold its breath. The rustle of leaves, the distant call of a predator, the subtle tremor of earth underfoot, all became part of a rhythm that had persisted through countless millennia. In this nocturnal hush, one could sense both the fragility and endurance of life, the inexorable forces of change, and the lingering presence of giants that had once dominated the earth. Though the era was waning, the impression it left on the land, and on those who would one day uncover its secrets, was profound and enduring. The first part of the story closes on a sense of measured tranquility. The giants continue their slow, ponderous existence amidst the shifting landscape, the wind moving across plains and forests alike, carrying scents, sounds, and the subtle vibrations of life. The world, while beautiful and seemingly eternal, hints at the impermanence that will eventually overtake it. Time moves forward inexorably, and though today it is still inhabited by these majestic creatures, tomorrow may bring change beyond comprehension. The morning light spilled slowly across the plains, pale and diffused, as if the sun itself were hesitant to disturb the quiet. Mist still clung to the low valleys, and the distant mountains appeared as soft silhouettes behind the gauzy veil. The marshes, still wet from overnight condensation, released the pungent perfume of decomposing vegetation, a mixture of rich, loamy earth and the subtle sweetness of newly sprouted plants. The air was damp, carrying the faint, musky scent of animals that had passed through the night. Every ripple in the water, every movement of reed or branch, was heightened in this delicate, suspended hour. In one of the wide clearings, a herd of colossal herbivores moved with deliberate grace. Their massive bodies, elongated necks, and heavy tails created a hypnotic rhythm as they advanced, crushing smaller plants beneath their feet and brushing against low-lying trees. The ground quivered slightly under their weight, sending vibrations through the soil that small mammals and reptiles perceived with acute sensitivity. The herd remained alert, heads occasionally raised, eyes sweeping the horizon. The faintest rustle in the underbrush, or an unfamiliar shadow, triggered subtle shifts in posture, demonstrating a collective awareness honed over generations. Among the tall ferns, smaller creatures thrived in relative safety. Lizard-like reptiles basked briefly on rocks warmed by the sun, only to scuttle away when the shadow of a giant passed overhead. Amphibians crouched in shallow depressions, their skins glistening with the lingering moisture of early morning. Insects swarmed above the marshy pools, carrying the scent of nectar from early blooming cycads. These minor presences, seemingly inconsequential against the backdrop of giants, played essential roles in the ecosystem, pollinating plants, dispersing seeds, and providing sustenance for predators and scavengers alike. Predators, patient and deliberate, observed from hidden vantage points. Theropods, lean and muscular, moved with a silent precision, muscles coiled beneath scaly hides. Their eyes, keen and unblinking, followed the herbivores, noting the gaps between individuals, the slow sway of their tails, and the brief pauses in movement that betrayed instinctive caution. Survival demanded calculation, and each step was a measured decision. Occasionally, a smaller carnivorous species would dart through the undergrowth, taking advantage of distractions or weakened members of the herd. Nature's rhythm, here, was slow yet merciless. Patience and timing were the currency of life. Waterholes served as silent arenas of tension. Along the banks, life congregated in a delicate balance, each species aware of the other. Sauropods bent their long necks to drink, nostrils flaring, while smaller reptiles darted between their massive legs to reach safer ground. Fish beneath the surface moved instinctively to avoid sudden shadows, and amphibians shifted closer to reeds and mud banks. Even the subtle stirrings of insects could provoke minor ripples across the water, a reminder that every entity, no matter how small, influenced the surrounding environment. The giants, largely indifferent to these smaller creatures, nonetheless shaped the very structure of the ecosystem through their passage. Forests dense and towering revealed a different tempo. Sunlight filtered through high canopies and golden beams, illuminating dust motes, leaves, and the occasional glint of scales. Conifers and cycads stood thick, their trunks furrowed and resilient, roots gripping the earth with persistence. Fallen branches and decaying logs provided homes for insects, fungi, and small vertebrates, creating microcosms of life beneath the towering giants. Herbivorous dinosaurs moved methodically, stripping leaves from high branches, brushing against ferns and low shrubs. Their presence reshaped the forest, opening paths and light gaps, influencing growth patterns and determining the distribution of vegetation for generations to come. Seasonal changes were subtle, but inexorable. Longer dry periods caused the rivers and streams to shrink, leaving behind pools of stagnant water teeming with life. Rainfall, when it returned, reshaped the landscape, carving new channels and washing away sediment. Plant life responded with careful timing. Cycads blossomed, ferns unfurled delicate fronds, and flowering plants offered nectar to the buzzing insects that facilitated pollination. Herbivores adjusted their movements accordingly, seeking fresh growth, moving to shaded valleys, and congregating around dwindling water sources. These slow adaptations defined the rhythm of life, a testament to the enduring cycles of growth, decay, and survival. In the plains beyond, winds swept across the open expanse, carrying dust and pollen over long distances. The motion of grasses and low shrubs created a subtle, undulating pattern across the landscape, a dance dictated by air currents. The giants, aware of these environmental cues, moved with innate understanding, their senses attuned to shifts in weather, distant roars of storms, and the faintest tremors in the earth. Life, in these moments, was a careful negotiation between observation and instinct, between patience and the immediate need to feed, hydrate, or avoid predation. Predatory interactions were slow, deliberate affairs, often spanning hours or days. A lone theropod might stalk a herd, maintaining distance, observing weaknesses, waiting for the precise moment when a gap in the formation or a momentary distraction provided opportunity. The prey, in turn, remained alert, sometimes responding with coordinated movement, sometimes relying on sheer bulk to deter attack. Every encounter left traces, footprints, broken branches, disturbed soil, and subtle scents that informed the next cycle of observation. The dance of predator and prey, though rarely concluded with immediate resolution, drove the evolution of both, shaping behavior, physiology, and even social structures over countless generations. Nightfall brought a different palette. The sky, now ink-dark, revealed countless stars reflected in pools and streams. Nocturnal creatures stirred, insects hummed and chirped, amphibians moved with cautious intent, and small reptiles patrolled territories beneath the cover of darkness. Predators adapted to the low light, relying on heightened senses to detect movement and sound. The giants rested, their immense bodies huddled or spaced apart, conserving energy while remaining subtly aware of their surroundings. The wind carried cooler air, carrying with it the scents of damp earth, flowering plants, and the occasional tang of decay, a reminder of the constant cycle of life and death. Occasionally, distant volcanic activity hinted at larger forces at play. Columns of smoke and ash, visible on the horizon, signaled change in progress. Earthquakes shifted the landscape subtly, altering watercourses, opening new marshes, and collapsing unstable cliffs. These events, rare and dramatic, left lasting impressions on the environment, challenging the adaptability of every species present. Life persisted, yet the undercurrent of inevitability threaded through all interactions. The world itself was in flux, and survival demanded constant awareness and adaptation. Along the riverbanks, the interdependence of species became evident. Small birds followed herbivores, feeding on insects stirred by their movement. Reptiles and amphibians took advantage of fallen fruit or leaves, while insects capitalized on nectar and moisture. Even the slightest environmental shift, a gust of wind, a drop in temperature, or a change in water clarity, altered the behaviors and interactions of countless creatures. The giants themselves, though largely solitary in their grazing, indirectly influenced these networks, their movements shaping the microenvironments and providing opportunities for smaller species to exploit. The forest floor, littered with decomposing leaves, broken branches, and occasional carcasses, supported a microcosm of activity. Fungi thrived in the nutrient-rich soil, breaking down organic matter into sustenance for plants. Insects fed on decaying wood, plants absorbed nutrients from the enriched ground, and the giants moved above this activity, their presence both imposing and largely indifferent. Here, the world seemed to operate on multiple scales simultaneously. The macro movements of enormous creatures above, the subtle negotiations of smaller animals below, and the slow, unyielding progress of decay and renewal interwoven through every layer. As days passed, gradual climatic shifts became noticeable. Prolonged dry spells reduced the flow of streams, creating shallow pools and concentrated areas for drinking. Plants adapted by producing deeper roots, shedding leaves, or entering dormancy. Herbivores migrated slowly, moving from depleted areas to those still fertile, while predators adapted their strategies accordingly. The land itself bore the marks of these changes: cracked soil, shifting sandbanks, and patches of vegetation either thriving or withering. The interconnectedness of life remained ever present, yet the pressure of environmental change began to hint at the vulnerability of even the mightiest creatures. The giants, in their ponderous persistence, displayed behaviours reflective of both instinct and adaptation. Social interactions among some species became evident. Subtle gestures, positioning within herds, and movement patterns suggested communication and hierarchy. Young were protected and guided, learning the pathways, watering holes, and safe grazing areas through observation and imitation. These intricate social structures, while largely invisible to casual observers, shaped survival outcomes and influenced reproductive success, creating generational continuity amidst the fluctuating pressures of the late Mesozoic. As night reclaimed the land once more, a stillness settled across forests, plains, and marshes alike. The wind softened, water stilled, and shadows deepened. Even the giants, massive and impervious by day, seemed to exhale with the rhythm of the earth. The interweaving of predator and prey, plant and soil, wind and water, created an intricate tapestry, a living chronicle of survival, adaptation, and endurance. In this quiet, one could almost sense the subtle shifts of time, the gradual reshaping of landscapes, and the persistent, silent march of life, forever negotiating the boundaries between existence and extinction. The sun rose slowly, pale and diffused, casting long, gentle shadows across the drying plains. Streams, once vigorous, now trickled weakly, revealing silty beds littered with fallen leaves, broken branches, and the occasional desiccated carcass of smaller creatures. The air smelled of dust and drying vegetation, with a faint, acrid tang where the marshes had begun to retreat. Each footfall of the massive herbivores stirred tiny clouds of sediment, a subtle but constant reminder of the fragility underlying the apparent permanence of the land. The giants, moving in their measured cadence, seemed aware of the changing conditions, their massive forms deliberate and cautious as they sought the diminishing pools of water and the freshest foliage. Forests, dense with conifers and cycads, still provided refuge, yet the undergrowth had thinned. New shoots struggled to rise from parched soil, and fallen leaves, once rapidly decayed, now lay in a slow, smothered rot. The air vibrated with the quiet hum of insects, fewer than before, their numbers diminished by the reduction in flora. Amphibians clung to the dwindling moisture of shallow ponds, while lizards and smaller mammals prowled the forest floor, keenly aware of the scarcity that framed their movements. Every creature's existence seemed measured against the slow decline of their surroundings, an unspoken competition for the resources that remained. On the plains, predator and prey were engaged in a slow, careful negotiation. Theropods, lean and patient, traced the edges of the diminishing herds, eyes scanning for weakness. Their approach was deliberate, measured, and silent. Even the faintest rustle of leaves or disturbance of soil could betray their presence. The herbivores, aware of these threats, moved with cautious deliberation, balancing their need to feed with the constant risk of attack. Young and old alike navigated these challenges, the former learning through observation and instinct, the latter relying on experience honed over decades. Each interaction, fleeting or prolonged, carried weight, leaving traces in the footprints, broken branches, and subtle imprints upon the landscape. Waterholes had become arenas of intensified activity, Animals of every size gathered in increased numbers, drawn to the few remaining pools. The tension was palpable. Smaller creatures sought shelter under larger bodies, predators moved stealthily along the peripheries, and the giants themselves lingered near the edges, nostrils flaring, ears alert. Even minor movements, a bird fluttering across the water's surface, the splash of a small amphibian provoked reactions from the assemblage, a delicate choreography of survival. Here, the dynamics of life and death were laid bare, observed in slow motion, each action carrying consequences for all involved. Marshes, once abundant and teeming, now revealed their slow decay. The water, shallow and stagnant, shimmered under the sun in patches of green and brown. Algae flourished in pools, and decaying plant matter lent a pungent, earthy aroma to the air. Insects buzzed lazily, while amphibians and small reptiles clustered near pockets of moisture. Predators, aware of these concentrations, moved with measured patience, waiting for the slightest misstep. Life here was more precarious, fragile against the backdrop of environmental decline, yet still vibrant in its persistence, every organism adapting, struggling, and enduring in its own way. Forests reflected a different reality. Canopies remained dense in some regions, yet gaps revealed where trees had succumbed to drought or disease. Fallen logs and decomposing plant matter were slower to decay, creating a muted, somber scent of rot. Small mammals and reptiles took refuge in these pockets, finding nourishment in the hidden abundance, while larger herbivores stripped the remaining leaves with painstaking deliberation. Predators moved among the shadows, muscles taut, senses finely attuned to movement and scent. Every day was a negotiation, a slow, careful balance between survival and exhaustion, each species adjusting to subtle shifts in the availability of food and water. The land itself bore the marks of change. Cracked soil extended across the plains, sandbanks shifted under the dry winds, and previously stable riverbeds had begun to fragment. Rainfall, once predictable, arrived in sudden bursts, washing away sediment and altering the topography in ways both subtle and dramatic. Vegetation adapted slowly, producing deeper roots, shedding leaves, or entering dormancy, while herbivores adjusted their migration paths accordingly. Predators, in turn, adapted their hunting strategies, timing their approaches with precision, waiting for opportunity in a world increasingly defined by scarcity. In the stillness of late afternoon, shadows lengthened across the plains. Giants, moving with deliberate slowness, traced arcs between feeding grounds and water sources, their immense forms casting long, trembling shadows over the cracked earth. Smaller creatures scurried in response to these movements, their survival dependent upon the careful navigation of space and timing. Even the wind seemed subdued, carrying only faint dry scents across the land, whispering of change yet to come. Time, once measured by the cycles of life, now bore the weight of inevitable decline, each moment a step closer to the erosion of an age. Predatory behaviours became more pronounced as resources dwindled. Theropods, once patient in their stalking, now adopted prolonged approaches, tracking herds over longer distances, exploiting subtle vulnerabilities. The herbivores in turn exhibited refined coordination, moving in tighter formations, constantly adjusting position and pace to maintain the integrity of the group. Each day's survival relied on experience, awareness, and the slow honing of instinctual behaviours passed across generations. The interplay between predator and prey, once balanced across expansive lands, now concentrated in areas where water and vegetation remained viable, heightening tension and sharpening every movement. Rivers, shrinking and sluggish, revealed hidden features. Sandbars, fallen branches and sediment deposits shaped the flow and accessibility of water. Fish, amphibians, and aquatic reptiles concentrated in deeper pools, vulnerable to predation from the banks. The giants, while largely indifferent to smaller inhabitants, shaped these microenvironments with each crossing crushing vegetation, stirring sediment, and creating temporary refuges for smaller species in the depressions left behind. The land was a dynamic system, where even the heaviest and largest could influence survival outcomes for countless others. Night descended with a muted grandeur. Stars appeared in the darkened sky, reflected in shallow pools and streams. Nocturnal creatures emerged, insect hums and amphibian calls forming a soft, layered symphony. Predators adapted to low light, moving with careful intent, while the giants rested in shallow clearings, occasionally stirring to adjust position or respond to subtle environmental cues. The wind carried the cool, dry scent of soil, interwoven with the lingering aromas of plant decay and moisture. Even in rest, the land pulsed with quiet activity, a persistent testament to the ongoing negotiation between life and the pressures of a changing world. In these slow, deliberate hours, the subtle signals of ecological decline became evident. Plant growth was uneven, with some species struggling against harsh conditions, while others opportunistically expanded into vacated spaces. Insects and small animals adapted to scarcity, shifting foraging behavior and timing to coincide with the availability of resources. Predators, responsive to these patterns, refined hunting strategies, exploiting both the vulnerabilities of prey and the dynamics of the environment. Even the giants, immense and enduring, were touched by these pressures, their survival dependent upon the balance between mobility, access to sustenance, and the preservation of energy across increasingly fragmented habitats. The twilight of the ecosystem extended across rivers, forests, and plains. The air carried a mixture of warmth and dryness, punctuated by the occasional dampness where shaded areas retained moisture. Birds, reptiles, and amphibians moved cautiously, while herbivores traced measured paths between food sources. Predators lingered in shadows, aware of the diminished options before them. Every movement, every choice, was a subtle negotiation between opportunity and risk, a slow unfolding of tension dictated by environmental constraints. Distant signs of volcanic activity hinted at larger, inexorable forces shaping the world. Smoke plumes and ash columns appeared intermittently on the horizon, marking the presence of subterranean upheaval. Earth tremors occasionally reverberated through soil and stone, unsettling both flora and fauna. These phenomena, though distant, altered river courses, disrupted vegetation patterns, and challenged the adaptive strategies of every species. Life continued to negotiate, respond, and endure, yet the undercurrent of inevitability threaded through every interaction, foreshadowing changes beyond the immediate perception of the giants themselves. The giants moved slowly, tracing the diminishing vegetation and pooling waters with a grace tempered by necessity. Social dynamics within herds became more pronounced. Positioning, protective behaviors, and guidance of younger individuals reflected both instinctual and learned adaptations. Every step, every pause carried significance in the broader survival of the species. Young observed and imitated elders, internalizing pathways, water sources, and subtle signals for safety. The balance of life predator and prey, flora and fauna, was increasingly delicate, yet resilient in its persistence, forming a living chronicle of adaptation against the slow erosion of their environment. As night deepened, the world seemed to contract. Shadows mingled with fading light, and the land, once expansive and vibrant, took on an austere and contemplative quality. Insects and amphibians persisted in the hidden crevices of marshes and forests, predators lingered in anticipation, and the giants rested with cautious awareness. The rhythms of life, though altered and strained, endured. The passage of time remained constant, marked not by rapid events, but by the persistent negotiation between survival and the inexorable progression of environmental change. Dawn broke in muted tones over the stretching plains, the sun rising behind a veil of pale mist that clung to the distant hills. The air was heavy with the scent of dry earth and charred foliage, remnants of a recent fire that had swept across a section of forest. Smoke lingered in thin streams, curling toward the sky, mingling with the morning light to create a muted golden haze. The once vibrant undergrowth lay blackened in patches, and scattered embers smouldered beneath fallen logs, threatening to ignite anew. The giants moved cautiously through this altered landscape, their massive forms casting long shadows over the charred remnants, nostrils flaring as they sensed the lingering acrid smell. In the clearing, the aftermath of the fire revealed the delicate balance of survival. Smaller creatures emerged cautiously, sniffing the air, scuttling across the cooling soil, and probing the ash-covered underbrush. Insects began to return, feeding on the new growth that would inevitably rise from nutrient-rich soil. Amphibians and small reptiles cautiously explored the pools left by the retreating water, their movements slow and deliberate. The land, though scarred, was already in subtle motion toward renewal, demonstrating the relentless persistence of life amidst adversity. Storm clouds gathered over the distant highlands, their low-hanging masses tinged with violet and grey. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of ozone and the first drops of rain. The giants moved steadily toward watercourses, aware of the approaching tempest. Streams swelled as rainfall began, washing sediment from dry riverbeds and reshaping the banks. Trees bent and groaned under the pressure of wind, their leaves rattling like fine chains. The chorus of weather, a distant rumble of thunder, the patter of rain, the swish of moving water dominated the plains, emphasizing the raw power of environmental forces in shaping the lives of every creature present. In these sudden changes, predator and prey adjusted with careful precision. Theropods sought shelter among dense groves, their sharp eyes scanning for disoriented or separated herbivores. The giants, despite their size, adapted instinctively, bending their movements to avoid weak ground, shifting between patches of remaining vegetation, and seeking shallow depressions to minimize exposure. Smaller mammals and reptiles found cover in the hollows of logs or the dense roots of overturned trees, while amphibians took refuge beneath rocks or in submerged pockets. Each species, regardless of scale, responded to the shifts of weather with a combination of instinct and learned behavior. The forest, though partially ravaged by fire, remained a complex ecosystem. Fallen trees provided new shelter and habitat for insects, birds, and small mammals, while standing trees offered refuge from the wind and rain. The damp soil released a musky aroma, rich with decomposed plant matter and the faint tang of resin from living conifers. The giants traced winding paths through the groves, careful to avoid unstable soil and scorched roots. The interplay of light and shadow created an intricate tapestry upon the forest floor, highlighting the persistent resilience of nature amid destruction. Riverbanks transformed under the storm's influence. Previously shallow pools deepened, creating temporary refuges for fish and amphibians. Sediment shifted, forming new sandbars and exposed roots. The giants drank cautiously, nostrils flaring as they sensed the movement of smaller creatures and the subtle currents beneath the surface. Predators, using the chaotic environment to their advantage, stalked along the edges, relying on both stealth and timing to capture unwary prey. Every drop of water and shift in the terrain dictated behavior, reinforcing the delicate interdependence of species in the changing landscape. Lightning arcs occasionally illuminated the sky, revealing the vast expanse of plains and distant forests. Shadows leaped across the terrain, highlighting the silhouettes of giants grazing or moving in herds. Thunder rolled across the horizon, echoing through valleys and distant hills, reverberating in the soil beneath their massive feet. Even the wind seemed to obey its own rhythms, sweeping across plains, bending trees, and carrying both the scent of rain and the distant aroma of burnt vegetation. The environment was no longer passive. It was an active participant in the ongoing struggle for survival. Amidst the shifting environment, vegetation adapted at its own pace. Cycads and ferns unfurled fresh fronds in the rain, taking advantage of the moisture to replenish lost foliage. Trees produced shoots from scorched roots, while flowering plants revealed delicate blossoms, their colours muted in the grey light. Smaller plants competed fiercely for sunlight and space, creating microhabitats where insects and small reptiles thrived. The giants, moving among these evolving patterns, played a role in shaping the distribution of flora, their foraging creating clearings and pathways, trampling weaker growth while nurturing regeneration in its wake. Across the plains, water scarcity forced migrations. Herds of herbivores moved with greater deliberation, following subtle shifts in vegetation and the faint scent of moisture carried by the wind. Predators adapted to these movements, trailing cautiously and timing their approaches with meticulous patience. The interplay of hunger and opportunity dictated the day's rhythm, each creature responding to both immediate necessity and long-honed instinct. Footprints, broken branches and bent reeds marked these migrations, leaving a living record of the persistent dance of survival in a changing world. Marshes, previously teeming with life, now reflected both scarcity and resilience. Pools receded, leaving behind mud flats and shallow depressions. Amphibians congregated near the last remaining pockets of water, while small reptiles and mammals used these areas as temporary refuges. Insects adapted to the drying environment, seeking moisture in hidden niches. Predators, aware of these concentrations, exercised heightened patience, waiting for opportunities that would rarely present themselves in abundance. The ecological balance, once stable, had become a continuous negotiation between adaptation and endurance. Nightfall brought a muted stillness over the landscape. Rain ceased, leaving the ground damp and fragrant. The giants rested near remaining water sources, their immense forms silhouetted against pools reflecting the dim moonlight. Nocturnal creatures emerged cautiously. Insects hummed softly in the moist air, and amphibians moved with deliberate slowness. Even in darkness, the land teemed with life, each organism adjusting behavior to the constraints imposed by both environment and survival instinct. The quiet, however, was fragile, a prelude to further changes the coming days might bring. As days turned into weeks, signs of ecosystem stress became more pronounced. Extended dry periods alternated with sudden storms, each event shaping plant growth, water availability, and animal movement. Forests, marshes, and plains displayed the combined effects of fire, flood, and drought. Smaller species adjusted with remarkable flexibility, exploiting niches left by disrupted vegetation. Herbivores altered migratory routes, congregating where foliage persisted, while predators recalibrated hunting strategies to cope with the shifting distribution of prey. Every change reverberated through the network of life, influencing behavior, survival, and the ongoing negotiation between species. The giants, massive and imposing, were not immune to these pressures. Changes in water availability and food distribution required careful planning and gradual adaptation. Herds modified routes, spacing, and grazing patterns. Young relied on elders to learn survival techniques, pathways to the last remaining water sources, and cues to avoid predation or environmental hazards. The movements of the giants themselves influenced the ecosystem, trampling vegetation, creating mud depressions in drying marshes, and leaving tracks that guided smaller creatures to water or shelter. Volcanic activity became increasingly evident. Distant eruptions sent ash and smoke into the sky, dimming sunlight and altering the quality of rainfall. Earth tremors shifted riverbeds, uprooted trees, and fractured the ground in areas once stable. These dramatic forces, operating over vast scales, reshaped the land in ways that demanded adaptation from every living creature. Ecosystems were in constant flux, survival now dependent not only on instinct and learned behavior, but on the ability to respond to environmental upheaval. By the twilight of this chapter, the land carried a sense of measured tension. Smoke drifted from distant fires, wind swept across drying plains, and watercourses reflected the dim light of the setting sun. The giants moved in cautious arcs between feeding grounds and water sources, while smaller creatures adjusted position and timing to maintain safety and access to resources. Predators lingered in shadows, calculating opportunities, aware of both the diminishing abundance and the heightened vulnerability of prey. The environment, both beautiful and unyielding, dictated rhythm, survival, and the slow march of time. The sky darkened with a sudden ferocity, clouds rolling in from distant mountains, their edges jagged and silvered with lightning. The wind tore across the plains, whipping dust, leaves, and loose vegetation into swirling vortices that danced across the cracked earth. Distant rumbles of thunder grew steadily, vibrating through soil and rock, reaching the massive feet of the giants as they moved with cautious deliberation. Each footfall pressed deep into softened earth, leaving impressions filled with sediment and scattered vegetation, a silent record of passage across a landscape increasingly shaped by chaos. Watercourses, once modest and contained, began to swell rapidly. Streams that had shrunk in recent months overflowed their banks, carrying a mixture of silt, uprooted plants, and small debris. Marshes expanded, reclaiming low-lying plains, and the smell of wet earth mixed with the tang of decaying vegetation. Fish and amphibians were forced to relocate constantly, following the shifting edges of deepening pools, while smaller mammals sought elevated ground or the roots of large trees to avoid inundation. The giants, attuned to the signs of impending flood, moved toward higher ridges, nostrils flaring as they assessed the shifting waters and scent of the air. Storms intensified with near-instantaneous power. Rain fell in torrents, hammering leaves, cracking soil, and forming rivulets that transformed dry gullies into rushing channels. Wind roared through forests, bending trees until branches cracked and fell with resounding thuds. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark electric clarity, revealing the movement of giants, predators, and the myriad smaller creatures navigating this upheaval. The interplay of light and shadow, sound and motion, created a chaotic yet rhythmically ordered panorama, each element a component of the immense, uncontrollable force of nature. The giants adapted with careful awareness. Herds moved slowly along elevated paths, necks swaying to balance immense weight, tails lifted to avoid unstable ground. The youngest and weakest were guided by elders, their steps measured against shifting soil and the ceaseless roar of wind and water. Every movement carried significance. The choice of a path, the pause to drink from a newly formed pool, or the subtle sidestep to avoid uprooted branches could determine survival. Even these colossal beings, once untouchable by minor disturbances, were now vulnerable to the full force of the environment. Predators exploited the storm with patience. Theropods stalked along newly exposed edges of marshes and pools, their keen eyes following herbivores navigating the flooded plains. Smaller carnivores took advantage of disoriented prey, darting through tangled vegetation or across mud-slicked ground. The tension between predator and prey, already heightened by scarcity of resources, was amplified under these conditions. Every misstep, every pause caused by wind or falling debris carried the weight of potential consequences. Survival required not only instinct, but acute attention to the volatile landscape. Forests bore the scars and majesty of the storm. Trees bent under the relentless wind, some snapping with splintered cries that echoed across valleys. Canopies were torn, leaves scattered, and fallen logs transformed into impromptu shelters or obstacles. The rain saturated the soil, leaving mud deep and slippery, challenging movement for both giants and smaller creatures. Watercourses running through these forests overflowed, forming small torrents that cut through roots, washed away delicate undergrowth, and shifted sediment, reshaping microhabitats. Yet even amidst destruction, the forest displayed resilience. New shoots emerged from broken branches, roots clung with stubborn persistence, and the scattered vegetation offered refuge to insects and small animals. Lightning strikes occasionally set small fires, smouldering among dry branches and fallen leaves. Smoke mingled with rain, a pungent reminder of the fragile balance between water and flame, growth and decay. The giants moved around these zones cautiously, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling for distant sounds of danger. Predators remained alert to disturbances, knowing that chaos could create sudden opportunities. Even minor species adapted rapidly. Amphibians retreated to submerged pockets, insects burrowed into soil or plant matter, and small mammals found refuge beneath thick roots. The environment, in its unpredictable fury, tested endurance, strategy, and adaptation at every scale. Rivers swollen by relentless rain reshaped themselves overnight. Sandbars, previously stable, were washed away, and banks collapsed under the weight of water and debris. Pools formed in unexpected depressions, while others drained as new channels carved paths through the land. Fish and amphibians moved swiftly, guided by instinct, while predators and herbivores adjusted positions to maintain access to food and shelter. The giants, navigating with innate understanding, avoided unstable banks and deep currents, using knowledge passed through generations. Every creature's survival was dictated by perception, timing, and responsiveness to sudden environmental shifts. Night fell with a dramatic intensity, the storm continuing its relentless performance. Thunder rolled across plains and valleys, each pulse vibrating through earth and air. Lightning fractured the sky at intervals, illuminating forests, rivers, and herds in stark contrast. Rain fell in sheets, battering leaves, mud, and water surfaces alike. Shadows and light danced continuously, revealing glimpses of movement. A predator stalking the edge of a pool, a small mammal darting beneath an uprooted log, the careful steps of giants navigating treacherous terrain. Even in darkness, life persisted, defined by a combination of instinct, awareness, and adaptation to extreme conditions. The ecosystem responded as a network. Fallen trees became temporary dams or shelter, redirected water flow creating new pools for amphibians and fish, while insects quickly colonized niches created by destruction. Plants that survived the storm or sprouted quickly from residual roots competed for light, space, and nutrients. Every action was interdependent, a subtle choreography orchestrated by environmental change and the relentless forces of survival. Giants, though dominant by size, were only one element in this intricate system. Their movements influenced sediment, plant growth, and the behaviors of smaller species alike. Over days, the storm subsided, leaving the land reshaped and altered. Pools formed in lowlands, rivers carved new paths, and forests bore both scars and signs of rapid regeneration. The giants moved cautiously, assessing the altered landscape, guiding young across mud-filled depressions and around fallen trees. Predators adapted to new positions of prey, while smaller creatures exploited freshly available niches, foraging in disturbed areas or seeking refuge along newly formed watercourses. The echoes of the storm persisted in the trembling earth, the flowing water, and the subtle, pervasive tension that lingered in every movement. Signs of volcanic activity intensified in the distance. Plumes of ash and smoke rose steadily into the sky, tinging sunlight with a muted sepia tone. Distant rumbles indicated subterranean unrest, shifting soil and rock over vast expanses. Even from afar, the giants and smaller creatures were affected. Winds carried the faint smell of sulfur and ash, altering feeding and movement patterns. Predators remained alert, aware that environmental chaos could create sudden opportunities, while herbivores adjusted their migrations, tracing paths through terrain increasingly defined by uncertainty. The land, though scarred and transformed, showed the resilience of life. Vegetation sprouted in nutrient-rich ash deposits, insects and small animals quickly colonized these zones, and even the giants moved through with adaptive precision. Pools collected water for drinking and habitat, marshes shifted and reformed, and forests displayed microcosms of survival and renewal. Every organism, from the smallest insect to the massive sauropod, participated in a web of interdependent adaptation, navigating forces that were both immediate and vast in scale. As the first stars appeared in the darkened sky, the giants rested in sparse clearings, tails sweeping lightly to dislodge lingering rainwater, nostrils flaring to sense distant movement. Smaller creatures adjusted positions among rocks, roots, and fallen logs, seeking shelter while maintaining access to essential resources. Predators lingered, vigilant, calculating the opportunities presented by both environmental shifts and the movements of other animals. The land, still humming with post-storm activity, offered a delicate balance between danger and sustenance, destruction and renewal, change and persistence. In the quiet hours before dawn, the world seemed to pause, yet the subtle rhythm of life continued. Water flowed through newly formed channels, leaves whispered in gentle breezes, and the movements of creatures both large and small created faint vibrations in the soil. The giants, enduring and ancient, reflected the persistence of life across scales. Every footprint, every overturned branch, every new pool of water told a story of adaptation, survival, and the inexorable march of time in a world increasingly defined by both fury and resilience. Morning arrived in muted hues, the sun struggling to penetrate the lingering ash haze from distant volcanic plumes. The plains appeared subdued, washed in tones of grey and pale gold, while forests bore the soot-stained foliage of recent fires. Pools of water reflected the dim light, their surfaces broken by the cautious movements of amphibians and small reptiles. The giants moved slowly across this scarred landscape, careful to navigate unstable soil and scattered debris. Their massive feet sank slightly into softened ground, leaving deep impressions that would endure for days, a testament to both their presence and the transformed nature of their environment. The consequences of recent storms and eruptions were evident across the ecosystem. Water sources were inconsistent, some pools filled, others drained or contaminated with ash and sediment. Vegetation varied in density. Some areas showed the first green shoots of regeneration, while others remained barren, the soil cracked and dry. Herbivores moved cautiously, grazing where forage remained viable, noses flaring to detect faint scents of moisture or fresh leaves. Young animals learned quickly, following elders along paths that maximized access to both sustenance and safety. Survival now depended on careful selection, adaptability, and constant awareness of environmental change. Predators were acutely aware of these vulnerabilities. Theropods moved stealthily along the edges of dwindling herds, capitalizing on weakened, young, or isolated individuals. Smaller carnivores exploited debris-littered terrain, darting through fallen logs or dense undergrowth to catch prey disoriented by storms and shifting habitats. Each hunt was measured, requiring both timing and acute observation. Prey responded with equally refined strategies: tight formations, careful scanning of the surroundings, and subtle shifts in direction to confuse or deter predators. Every encounter carried the amplified tension of scarcity, reinforcing the delicate interplay between predator and prey. Rivers and marshes remained focal points of survival. Pools provided essential hydration, while marshy edges offered refuge for amphibians, reptiles, and small mammals. The giants' movements around these water sources shaped the microhabitats. Footprints created depressions that collected rainwater, fallen trees formed bridges and shelters, and grazing patterns influenced plant regrowth. Predators utilized these dynamics, predicting the paths of herbivores and exploiting temporary concentration points. The rhythm of life, once stable across broad expanses, now followed a more intense localized cadence dictated by limited resources. Forests displayed both resilience and vulnerability. Charred patches coexisted with emerging green shoots, creating a mosaic of survival and renewal. Fallen branches and trunks provided shelter for insects and small vertebrates, while standing trees offered cover from predators and elements. Rain-soaked soil released the rich aroma of decomposing plant matter, mingling with the faint tang of resin from living conifers. Herbivores traced paths through this complex landscape, avoiding weakened trees and unstable ground while feeding on the sparse but nutrient-rich foliage. The giants' presence influenced both terrain and behavior, their massive bodies shaping the forest in subtle, persistent ways. Migration became a necessity. Extended dry periods and localized flooding forced herds to trace new paths in search of water and forage. Elders guided the young along established routes, but increasingly they were forced into unfamiliar terrain, encountering obstacles, predators, and competition from other groups. The journey itself demanded energy, attention, and coordination. Predators, attuned to these movements, followed strategically, recognizing opportunities in the disorientation or fatigue of prey. Every step carried weight. The balance of survival, energy expenditure, and risk became a persistent underlying tension. Smaller species displayed remarkable adaptability. Insects colonized recently exposed soil, feeding on decaying matter and newly sprouted vegetation. Amphibians concentrated near permanent water pockets, while small reptiles navigated shifting undergrowth to exploit shelter and prey availability. Mammals, cautious and observant, moved along corridors created by larger creatures, finding temporary refuge and foraging opportunities. These microcosms, though easily overlooked, were critical to the continuity of ecosystems. Each subtle adjustment reinforced the interconnectedness of species and the fragile equilibrium maintained even amidst environmental upheaval. The giants themselves showed evidence of loss. Some herds had diminished in number, the young or elderly failing to survive extreme conditions or predation. Behavioral adjustments became more pronounced. Herds tightened formations, movements slowed to conserve energy, and the guidance of young became even more deliberate and attentive. Footpaths shifted, grazing areas were carefully selected, and resting zones moved closer to reliable water sources. The scale of environmental pressure was palpable, shaping behavior, influencing survival, and reinforcing the vulnerability of even the largest and strongest species. Predatory strategies adapted to these new conditions. Hunger-driven behaviors intensified. Stalking became longer and more calculated, with predators trailing weakened or separated members over extended distances. Smaller carnivores exploited microhabitats created by storm debris or volcanic ash, seizing opportunities presented by disoriented or fatigued prey. Even previously safe individuals were forced to remain alert constantly, adapting their movement and feeding behaviors to the heightened pressures of survival. Every interaction was framed by scarcity, the stakes heightened, the rhythms of life sharpened. Watercourses and marshes continued to evolve. Pools fluctuated in size and depth, sediment shifted, and vegetation around edges adapted to both moisture and flood. Amphibians and fish moved dynamically, following ephemeral channels and seeking temporary refuges. Insects colonized exposed mud and decaying plant matter, while reptiles and mammals navigated shifting terrain. The giants, largely indifferent to the smaller organisms, indirectly shaped these microhabitats, leaving depressions, paths, and obstacles that influenced the distribution and behavior of other species. The land itself was both actor and stage, dynamic and influential. Nightfall offered a brief reprieve. The wind softened, rain ceased, and the air carried the faint tang of moisture and vegetation. The giants rested, forming protective arcs around their young and vulnerable members. Predators lingered in shadow, calculating movements, testing boundaries, and waiting for opportunities that might present themselves in the dim moonlight. Insects hummed softly, amphibians moved cautiously, and the forest whispered with subtle vibrations of activity. Even in darkness, life persisted, shaped by the intertwined pressures of environmental scarcity, predation, and the need for renewal. Over subsequent days, the consequences of environmental pressures became more evident. Herbivores, adapting to reduced vegetation, expanded their range, occasionally encountering rival herds or fragmented resources. Predators followed, exploiting gaps or weakness, and interactions became more frequent and intense. Mortality among the youngest, weakest, or isolated individuals increased, reshaping herd structures and social dynamics. Water scarcity forced concentrated gatherings, intensifying competition and creating heightened tension among species. These pressures, though gradual, revealed the fine line between endurance and collapse. Forest regeneration occurred in patches. Charred soil enriched by ash promoted selective plant growth, creating pockets of early successional vegetation. Insects, amphibians, and small reptiles exploited these niches, while herbivores grazed selectively, shaping the regeneration patterns. Predators monitored these areas, aware that concentrations of prey would emerge with the new growth. The cycle of destruction and renewal reinforced the interdependence of species, emphasizing adaptation and resilience against the slow, inexorable pressures of a changing Mesozoic landscape. The giants, though enduring, demonstrated the limits of resilience. Herds were smaller, more cautious, and more tightly coordinated. Pathways were measured, water sources prioritized, and resting areas carefully chosen. Young animals learned the subtle cues from elders: how to navigate shifting soil, avoid unstable trees, detect predator presence, and interpret the signs of environmental change. Every action carried weight, influencing survival outcomes and shaping the adaptive behavior of the next generation. The land, both challenging and sustaining, dictated the rhythm of life, highlighting the delicate balance between strength, awareness, and environmental constraint. As twilight settled, the landscape exhaled a quiet, measured tension. Rivers and marshes reflected the fading light, forests whispered with the gentle movements of small creatures, and the giants rested with cautious awareness. Predators, patient and calculating, lingered in shadow, observing, waiting. The world was both scarred and enduring, devastation and renewal intertwined, scarcity and opportunity interwoven, life negotiating every moment with subtle awareness and persistent instinct. Even in the face of adversity, the pulse of existence continued, measured in the steps of giants, the flight of insects, and the quiet flow of water across a land forever reshaped. The sun rose pale and tentative, filtered through the lingering haze of ash and dust that clung stubbornly to the atmosphere. The plains appeared muted, colours subdued by layers of fine sediment carried from distant eruptions and recent storms. Pools of water reflected the grey sky, their surfaces punctuated by the movement of small fish and amphibians seeking shelter along the shallow edges. The giants moved with deliberate caution, their massive forms shifting slowly across softened ground, avoiding unstable patches and remnants of toppled trees. Each step left deep impressions in the mud, carrying the memory of both weight and survival across the altered landscape. Environmental pressures had intensified over recent weeks. Water sources had become increasingly scarce and unpredictable, forcing herds of herbivores to concentrate around the remaining pools. Vegetation was patchy, Some areas flourished with new shoots, nourished by nutrient-rich ash deposits, while others remained dry and brittle, struggling to recover from fire and flood. The giants adapted their movements to account for these fluctuations, guiding the young and weak along paths that maximized access to food and water while minimizing exposure to predators. Every decision carried consequence. Every delay could cost a life. Predators were more active and calculating than ever. Theropods tracked weakened individuals and smaller groups that had strayed from the main herds, their lean bodies moving with the precision of practiced hunters. Smaller carnivores exploited the chaotic terrain created by storms and volcanic activity, darting between debris and vegetation to capture prey distracted by environmental stress. Each predator's success was a delicate balance of patience, timing, and opportunity. Prey species in turn relied on tight formations, constant vigilance, and subtle shifts in behavior to counter these threats. Survival depended on acute perception, adaptive behavior, and the ability to respond quickly to an unpredictable landscape. Forest patches offered both refuge and challenge. Charred areas coexisted with regrowth, creating a mosaic of opportunities and hazards. Fallen trees and broken branches provided shelter for small creatures, while standing conifers offered cover from predators and elements. Herbivores moved cautiously through these zones, feeding selectively on available foliage while avoiding unstable ground and weakened trees. The giants' movements influenced the distribution of plants and smaller animals, trampling new shoots in some areas while creating microhabitats in depressions and mud tracks. The forest was a dynamic arena of survival, shaped continuously by both life and environmental forces. Rivers and marshes became focal points of competition. Water scarcity concentrated life into predictable locations, increasing interactions and tension. Fish and amphibians navigated constantly shifting currents, while reptiles and small mammals sought shelter along elevated banks or beneath vegetation. The giants congregated near these water sources, nostrils flaring, ears swiveling, and muscles poised for movement. Predators exploited the concentration of herbivores, using stealth and patience to identify vulnerable individuals. Every encounter reinforced the delicate balance between opportunity and risk, with survival dictated by perception, timing, and instinct. Migration patterns evolved as herds responded to environmental constraints. Extended dry periods and localized flooding required movement into unfamiliar terrain. Elders guided the young along shifting paths, teaching routes to water, safe grazing zones, and the avoidance of predators. Predators followed strategically, exploiting fatigue, confusion, or isolation among herbivores. These journeys were measured, deliberate, and fraught with risk. Each step carried the weight of survival, shaping behavior, social dynamics, and the long-term persistence of species in a fluctuating landscape. Smaller species demonstrated remarkable adaptability. Insects colonized newly exposed soil and decaying matter, amphibians moved dynamically between pools, and small reptiles navigated complex undergrowth to access food and shelter. Mammals exploited corridors created by larger creatures, moving cautiously through the environment to avoid both predators and environmental hazards. These microcosms were critical to ecosystem continuity, illustrating the interdependence of species and the necessity of adaptation at every scale. The giants showed signs of cumulative stress. Herds were smaller, and social behaviors intensified. Protective circles around the young, strategic positioning during movement, and careful selection of resting locations. Young animals relied increasingly on elders to interpret environmental cues, identify safe pathways, and avoid predators. Footpaths shifted in response to both natural changes and the accumulated experience of the herds. Their survival required acute awareness, learned behavior, and the adaptation of instinct to a world increasingly shaped by scarcity and unpredictability. Predatory behaviors intensified as resources remained scarce. Theropods extended hunting ranges, following weakened or isolated prey over greater distances. Smaller carnivores exploited temporary shelters and obstacles created by storms, fires, and ash deposits. Herbivores tightened formations, increased vigilance, and modified feeding patterns to reduce risk. Every movement and choice carried heightened consequence, as scarcity amplified the stakes of survival for both predator and prey. Watercourses and marshes shifted continually. Pools appeared and disappeared with the rain and drainage, sediment reshaped the banks, and vegetation adapted slowly to moisture fluctuations. Amphibians and fish adjusted constantly, moving with the changing environment. Insects and small mammals exploited exposed areas, while reptiles moved cautiously along shifting undergrowth. The giants, by contrast, influenced the terrain indirectly, their movements altering sediment, creating depressions for water accumulation, and leaving paths that smaller creatures would later exploit. The ecosystem functioned as a dynamic network, shaped by both environmental forces and the actions of its inhabitants. Night brought temporary reprieve. The wind softened, rain subsided, and the land exhaled a muted calm. The giants rested in clusters, forming protective arcs around vulnerable individuals. Predators lurked in shadows, calculating opportunities, their patience amplified by scarcity. Insects hummed softly, amphibians shifted cautiously, and the forest whispered with subtle motion. Even in darkness, the rhythms of survival persisted, defined by scarcity, vigilance, and interdependent adaptation. Over subsequent days, the effects of resource concentration became increasingly apparent. Herbivores competed for limited foliage, water sources became crowded, and inter-herd interactions occasionally escalated into conflict. Predators capitalized on these gatherings, targeting the weakest or most isolated members. Mortality among young and aged individuals rose, altering herd structures and social hierarchies. The pressure of survival intensified, shaping behavior, relationships, and the movement patterns of every species within the ecosystem. Forest regeneration continued in pockets, forming complex mosaics of life amid destruction. Ash-enriched soil promoted selective growth, attracting insects and small vertebrates. Herbivores grazed on these emerging patches, influencing regeneration patterns, while predators monitored these areas for concentrations of prey. Life persisted in intricate balance, the consequences of environmental stress evident in both survival and adaptation. The giants, despite their size and strength, remained vulnerable to the cumulative pressures of scarcity and environmental change. Herd coordination was essential. Pathways were carefully selected, feeding areas chosen with attention to resource availability, and resting zones strategically located. Young learned rapidly from elders, internalizing subtle environmental cues, predator signals, and safe movement patterns. Each action influenced survival outcomes, demonstrating the delicate interplay between instinct, learning, and environmental constraint. As twilight approached, the landscape assumed a muted contemplative tone. Rivers reflected the dimming light, forests whispered with subtle movement, and the giants rested, vigilant yet weary. Predators lingered in shadows, waiting patiently, while smaller creatures exploited microhabitats and emerging vegetation. The land was at once fragile and enduring. Destruction and regeneration intertwined, scarcity and opportunity interwoven, life negotiating every moment with awareness and instinct. Even amid adversity, the pulse of existence continued, measured in the steps of giants, the flight of insects, and the subtle flow of water through a land forever reshaped. The air grew heavier as the season advanced, burdened by the scent of decay and the metallic tang of ash that drifted from distant volcanic ridges. The once familiar rhythms of the plains had become irregular, punctuated by sudden storms, tremors, and the faint rumble of shifting earth beneath the surface. Vegetation, once abundant, appeared in isolated pockets, green islands surrounded by expanses of dry sediment and scorched soil. The great herds had begun their long migration toward regions still capable of sustaining life, driven by instinct, memory, and the slow erosion of options. Movement across the altered land was deliberate and costly. Each step left deep impressions in brittle ground that fractured under pressure. Smaller creatures followed in the giants' tracks, exploiting the shallow depressions where moisture lingered longest. The sun burned pale through a haze of fine dust that dimmed light but magnified heat. Even the wind seemed fatigued, carrying with it the ghostly whisper of forests long gone and the distant calls of species pushed to the margins of existence. The herds pressed onward, their progress measured by necessity rather than distance. Younger individuals struggled to keep pace, their limbs trembling with exhaustion. Adults formed protective barriers around them, guiding the young through unstable terrain and toward the faint promise of greener pastures. The elders moved slower now, burdened by age and memory, their every step deliberate, each breath heavy with the knowledge that the world they knew was changing beyond recognition. Predators shadowed the migration at a distance. They knew the rhythm of these journeys, the predictable moments of vulnerability, the narrow crossings, the dry valleys where water had vanished, the nights when fatigue overcame vigilance. Packs of theropods watched from the edges of ridges, their eyes reflecting faint traces of light as they tracked potential prey. Smaller scavengers followed in their wake, sensing opportunity in the exhaustion of others. The balance between predator and prey remained unchanged in principle, but desperation sharpened every instinct. In the midst of scarcity, violence grew more frequent. Clashes between herds erupted as territories overlapped and resources dwindled. The deep bellows of the giants echoed across the plains, reverberating like thunder as massive bodies collided in displays of strength and dominance. Dust rose in swirling columns, obscuring the view as the contest unfolded. Brief, intense struggles that determined access to water or grazing rights. When the dust settled, the defeated retreated in silence, leaving behind broken branches, trampled earth, and the fading echoes of defiance. The survivors of these confrontations regrouped and continued forward, their ranks thinner but their resolve intact. Each new dawn brought a landscape subtly transformed. Riverbeds that had once carved steady paths through fertile plains now lay dry and fractured, their channels marked by the skeletal remains of fish and reptiles caught in sudden drought. Forest edges receded daily, replaced by stretches of grass brittle as parchment. The chorus of life that once filled the air, buzzing insects, croaking amphibians, and the distant calls of birds had grown subdued, replaced by a sombre quiet that hung heavy over the land. Storms brought both relief and destruction. When they came, they arrived with violent intensity walls of dark cloud racing across the horizon, followed by sheets of rain that tore at the earth and carved new channels through the plains. Lightning illuminated the migrating herds, their silhouettes momentarily etched against a trembling sky. Water pooled in sudden abundance, transforming dust into mire and drowning the fragile vegetation that had clung to life. Yet even these tempests were fleeting. Within days, the heat returned, drawing moisture back into the sky and leaving the ground cracked and desolate once more. Amid these cycles, smaller species adapted with astonishing resilience. Amphibians burrowed deep into moist soil, reptiles basked on newly exposed rock formations, and small mammals adjusted their foraging to the erratic rhythms of rain and drought. Insects proliferated in short bursts, thriving briefly before vanishing with the next environmental shift. Each species responded to change not through strength, but through flexibility, the ability to endure by altering behavior, diet, or range. The giants, bound by their size and physiology, had fewer options. Their strength was both their gift and their limitation. Movement demanded enormous energy. Feeding required vast expanses of vegetation that were rapidly disappearing. They pushed onward toward the remaining wetlands and coastal lowlands where life still clung to equilibrium. The journey was measured in attrition. Each day claimed the weak, the injured, the aged. Predators followed patiently, their survival secured by the inevitable pace of collapse. When the herds finally reached the lowlands, the sight before them was both promise and warning. Water glimmered in shallow basins reflecting the shifting colours of a polluted sky. Vegetation clustered thickly along the edges, lush but fragile. The air was heavy with humidity, carrying the chorus of insects and the distant croaks of amphibians. Yet beneath this illusion of abundance lay instability. The soil saturated, the rivers prone to sudden floods, and the air thick with volcanic residue. Still, for a time, life flourished again in this fragile refuge. The giants grazed in cautious peace, spreading across the wetlands in measured rhythm. Young individuals splashed in shallow pools while adults fed along the fringes. Predators circled but hesitated, wary of the collective strength of the herds. For a few brief weeks, equilibrium returned. The land exhaled, reclaiming a hint of its former vitality. Plants grew rapidly, nourished by mineral-rich sediment. Amphibians spawned in abundance. Insects swarmed in iridescent clouds above the water. Yet even as life flourished, subtle signs of instability lingered. Tremors beneath the ground, the distant roar of unseen mountains, and the persistent haze that dimmed the sun. The return of hardship was gradual but inevitable. Rain patterns shifted unpredictably, rivers overflowed, flooding the lowlands and driving herds to higher ground. Ash fell intermittently from unseen eruptions, coating leaves in fine grey powder that dulled photosynthesis and suffocated new growth. The water turned acidic in places, corroding shells and poisoning small aquatic life. Predators, driven by hunger, resumed their relentless pursuit, their movements more daring and aggressive. The fragile calm fractured under the weight of necessity. As the cycle repeated, flood, drought, ash, and scarcity, the balance of the ecosystem began to collapse. Forests failed to regenerate between disturbances. The soil hardened into clay, resistant to new life. Smaller species migrated or vanished. The giants, once the undisputed masters of their domain, now appeared as remnants of an era fading into extinction. Their calls echoed across empty valleys, resonant but unanswered, fading into the dust-laden air. The sky grew darker as atmospheric particles thickened, filtering sunlight into a dim, amber glow. Temperatures fluctuated, wildly blistering heat by day, chilling cold by night. The air carried a faint metallic scent, a constant reminder of the unseen forces reshaping the planet. The herds grew restless, their movements erratic, guided less by instinct than by desperation. The land that had sustained them for generations had become a labyrinth of peril, shifting with each tremor, each storm, each new fall of ash. Predators adapted swiftly, their lean forms navigating the broken terrain with ease. They hunted in smaller, more efficient groups, exploiting the fatigue of prey that could no longer afford to flee far. Carcasses dotted the landscape, quickly claimed by scavengers and insects. The cycle of decay accelerated, feeding back into the soil in strange, uneven ways. Even in collapse, the planet remained dynamic, transforming destruction into the raw materials of new beginnings. Nightfall over the dying wetlands carried a haunting beauty. The haze glowed faintly in the reflected light of distant storms. Pools of water shimmered with volcanic residue, their surfaces rippling with the movements of amphibians and insects. The calls of the giants grew softer, blending with the wind and the distant rumble of shifting earth. Lightning flashed beyond the horizon, illuminating the silhouettes of creatures moving through the mist, ghostly reminders of a world that persisted even as it unraveled. By the time dawn returned, the air was colder, thinner, quieter. The giants moved slowly, their pace uncertain. Fewer young remained. The herds had splintered, some heading toward the coast, others deeper inland, following faint traces of vegetation. The predators, too, had changed. Fewer now, leaner, more cautious. Each step across the fractured land carried the weight of endings and the whisper of transformation. The world was preparing for a threshold it did not yet understand. The echoes of their movement faded gradually, swallowed by the wind and the ash. What remained was not silence, but a deep, resonant stillness, the kind that precedes great change. The plains stretched empty beneath the veiled sun, the forest reduced to skeletal remains, the rivers thin and wandering. Yet beneath the surface, unseen seeds of future life waited, dormant but enduring. The age of giants was drawing to a close, but the story of the earth was far from finished. The world darkened slowly, as though the sky itself had grown weary of bearing light. The haze that had once dulled the sun thickened into a vast shroud that blotted out its presence entirely. Days and nights blurred into a single, muted twilight, where shadows had no source and time moved without distinction. The air cooled steadily, the warmth of the earth bleeding away into the endless canopy of ash and dust suspended above. Silence deepened until it seemed to press upon every living thing that remained. The great forests, already diminished by drought and flame, succumbed to the weight of their own frailty. Leaves withered and fell in drifts that turned to dust before they touched the ground. The trunks of ancient trees cracked under the strain of cold and hunger, releasing hollow echoes into the dim air. The smell of decay became constant, a dry, mineral scent mingled with the faint bitterness of volcanic residue. Streams that had once carried the lifeblood of the plains shrank into thin, sluggish trickles, their surfaces coated in a silvery film that reflected no light. The giants, those last and solemn witnesses of an age fading into shadow wandered through the wasteland with diminishing strength. Their movements were slow, almost ritualistic, guided by memory rather than hope. Skin hung loose over their frames, their breaths came heavy and uneven. They paused often, listening to the unfamiliar stillness, as though expecting an answer that would never come. Herds had dissolved into scattered remnants, small groups bound by instinct and the faint comfort of presence. Predators fared no better. Their strength waned as prey disappeared. The sharp hunger that had once driven them became a dull ache, their roars reduced to hollow growls lost in the wind. Many lay still beneath the grey canopy, their forms soon covered by falling ash. The once intricate web of life had frayed to near invisibility, each thread breaking with quiet inevitability. The air grew colder still. Frost began to form along the edges of stagnant pools, delicate patterns etched into surfaces that had never known ice. It crept along the exposed roots of dying trees and across the rough hides of sleeping creatures, glinting faintly in the dim light. The transition from warmth to chill was relentless and unhurried, an unseen tide that claimed the land inch by inch. Far to the west, mountains glowed faintly red as volcanic fire burned through fissures in the crust. The eruptions that had once seemed sporadic were now near constant, their distant rumbling merging with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Rivers of molten rock carved new paths through desolate valleys, briefly illuminating the ashen landscape with fleeting glimpses of crimson. Ash clouds billowed upward in endless succession, feeding the darkness that blanketed the world. In this half-lit gloom, the last fragments of green life clung desperately to existence. Mosses and ferns, more ancient than the forests that had followed them, endured in the damp hollows and shaded crevices where moisture still lingered. Their resilience was quiet but profound, a whisper of continuity amid the chorus of endings. Insects sought refuge among them, moving sluggishly through the cold. Tiny creatures burrowed deeper, retreating into the soil where the warmth of the planet's core still offered a fragile sanctuary. The giants gathered near the remaining bodies of water, their movements hesitant and deliberate. They drank in slow, measured motions, the sound of water against their tongues echoing across the barren plain. Around them the ground was littered with bones bleached by ash and time. Each breath produced a faint plume of condensation, visible only for a moment before fading into the grey air. Their calls, once resonant and commanding, had become muted, more vibration than sound, carrying only short distances before dissolving into the fog. Nights grew longer, though no one could distinguish their beginning or end. The temperature fell below the endurance of most creatures. Ice began to form along the riverbeds and within the cracks of stone. Rain turned to sleet, then to snow-fine ashen flakes that drifted slowly downward, merging indistinguishably with the constant fall of volcanic dust. The landscape took on a monochrome hue, stripped of colour and warmth. Beneath this desolation, the planet continued to move and breathe. Deep currents of magma shifted beneath the crust, forcing land upward, reshaping coastlines and mountain ranges. Seas withdrew, revealing new expanses of barren seabed scattered with the remnants of ancient life. Storms swept across the oceans, their winds carrying the faint echo of thunder over waters that no longer reflected light. In the oceans, life fared little better. The surface waters cooled and darkened, depriving plankton of sunlight. Coral reefs, those delicate architectures of calcium and colour, crumbled into lifeless stone. Fish, disoriented by the cold and the loss of oxygen, drifted near the surface, their bodies rolling in the slow current. Yet even in this dying sea, some forms persisted. Tiny crustaceans, bacteria thriving on volcanic vents, and organisms so small they defied extinction through sheer adaptability. Back on land, the air thinned further, heavy with fine dust that clogged lungs and dulled senses. The few remaining herbivores struggled to find sustenance among the brittle remnants of vegetation. Some collapsed where they stood, their vast forms becoming monuments to endurance. Others pressed onward, following instincts older than memory, drawn toward regions where faint warmth rose from the earth valleys, heated by underground fire, or coastlines where steam rose from cracks in the ground. Days passed in dim procession. The cold deepened. The volcanic glow that had once burned at the horizon faded as eruption subsided, leaving only silence and stillness. The wind, once constant, grew sporadic and weak. The ash that filled the air began to settle, layer upon layer, until it blanketed the land in a soft, suffocating pallor. From above, the world might have appeared peaceful, motionless, uniform, timeless. But beneath that still surface lay the memory of movement, of sound, of breath. Then, gradually, imperceptibly, the change began again. The ash that had buried the world formed an insulative crust, trapping the faint warmth of the planet beneath. Beneath this blanket, the soil remained damp, rich with minerals released by decay and fire. Seeds that had lain dormant for seasons or centuries began to stir. At first, there was no sign of life above the surface, only the faintest chemical activity within the darkness. Then, one by one, small shoots broke through the hardened crust, pale and fragile, reaching toward a sky that remained dim but was no longer completely black. The air, still cold, began to clear as volcanic activity waned. Particles settled, and faint beams of light pierced the canopy for the first time in countless days. The light was weak, filtered and uncertain, yet it awakened the dormant world. The ice at the edges of rivers melted slowly, forming narrow channels of flowing water. The sound of trickling streams returned, soft, hesitant but unmistakable. Small creatures emerged from their refuges, cautious and blinking. Insects stirred first, drawn to the returning warmth. Then came amphibians, their slick bodies glistening as they moved toward the new pools. The world, though scarred and silent, began to breathe once more. The giants were gone. Their echoes lingered only in the shapes of the valleys they had crossed, the depressions left by their steps and the bones embedded in the newly forming sediment. Yet their absence marked not an end, but a transition, a space cleared for what would follow. The earth, in its vast indifference, had simply turned another page. Over time, the sky lightened further. The air warmed by degrees. Vegetation returned in cautious waves, ferns, mosses and hardy shrubs spreading across the plains. Life reclaimed the silence inch by inch, its rhythm slow but unstoppable. The bones of the past sank deeper into the soil, preserved as silent witnesses to an age of wonder and ruin. From the vantage of eternity, the extinction that had seemed so total was only a pause, a breath between eras. The memory of the giants persisted not in sound or sight, but in the quiet architecture of the world itself, in the patterns of rivers shaped by their migrations, in the composition of the soil enriched by their passing, in the balance of the air renewed by the slow return of green. The light grew stronger. The first dawn in an age broke across the horizon, golden and pale, filtering through the remnants of ash that drifted in the upper atmosphere. The land glowed faintly under its touch, revealing the contours of a changed planet. From beneath the surface, new life continued to rise, unburdened by memory, unaware of the vast lineage that had preceded it. The echoes of the lost giants lingered in the stillness, neither mournful nor triumphant, merely part of the endless cadence of creation and decay. The earth, patient and unhurried, turned toward a new chapter, its silence now filled with the quiet promise of beginning again. The first light came softly, filtering through the thinning veil of dust that had shrouded the world for generations. It fell unevenly across the scarred land, illuminating ridges of ash and stone, glinting on the surfaces of frozen rivers now beginning to thaw. The air was still cold, but the cold was no longer absolute. Beneath its edge lay a fragile warmth, tentative yet insistent. The planet exhaled. The silence that had once been complete began to fracture under the slow, deliberate return of sound. At first it was a whisper, the trickle of melting water descending through the cracks of ancient stone. Then came the faint rustle of wind moving through brittle stems and the almost imperceptible hum of insects emerging from long dormancy. Each sound was small and fleeting, yet together they formed the first fragile chorus of renewal. The land itself bore the memory of devastation. Vast plains stretched where forests had stood, their surfaces layered with ash compacted into pale strata. Mountains had shifted and cracked, their peaks blackened and raw from fire. Rivers had redrawn their courses, cutting new valleys through the sediment of extinction. Yet from the perspective of the returning sun, the world was not dead, it was merely transformed. In the shadow of broken cliffs, Moss spread like a slow breath across damp stone. The first shoots of fern unfurled, pale and translucent, drinking in the thin light. Algae stained the edges of pools in faint green halos, spreading outward as warmth deepened. Each new leaf, each drop of water, seemed to pulse with a silent memory of endurance. Life had been diminished, but not extinguished. Its essence had persisted in the dark, waiting for this hesitant dawn. The oceans too stirred. Their surfaces, once muted under layers of volcanic dust, reflected light once more, dull at first, then shimmering as clarity returned. The chemistry of the water had changed. Ash and minerals, once deadly, now fed the smallest forms of life. Microscopic organisms multiplied in abundance, forming invisible clouds that drifted through the currents. From these invisible colonies, the new foundations of life began to rebuild themselves. Coral-like forms returned in primitive clusters, anchoring themselves to submerged rock. Small, translucent creatures navigated the dim waters, their bodies glowing faintly in the filtered light. Over countless cycles, these delicate forms multiplied, diversified, and spread each generation, a silent testament to resilience. The seas, which had fallen silent, began again to murmur with motion and hunger. On land, the transformation moved slowly but steadily. Rain returned not in torrents but in fine, persistent mist that nourished the soil without eroding it. Over the plains, ferns grew taller, their fronds arching toward the pale sun. Where rivers met the sea, deltas formed, layered with new sediments rich in nutrients. Small arthropods crawled through the damp earth, leaving thin trails in the mud. Amphibians, descendants of those who had survived in burrows and hollows, began to explore again, their movements cautious and deliberate. In the absence of giants, the landscape felt vast and strangely intimate. No thunder of herds disturbed the stillness, no echo of titanic movement shook the ground. The balance of life had reset to a quieter scale, measured in breaths, ripples, and the slow expansion of roots. The horizon stretched unbroken, its emptiness filled not with sorrow, but with possibility. As centuries passed, the colour returned. Lichens and mosses deepened from pale green to vivid emerald. The sky, once muted to grey, took on a faint blue hue as dust settled and the atmosphere cleared. Sunlight grew stronger, piercing through layers of vapour to warm the land below. Seasons, once chaotic, began to stabilise, marked by the rhythm of growth and decay. Forests began again, though they were unlike those that had preceded them. The trees were smaller, their trunks slender and flexible, their leaves adapted to the cooler air. They grew in clusters along rivers and lakes, spreading outward year by year, until they covered the lowlands in a new, subdued canopy. Beneath them, ferns and cycads flourished, weaving a green tapestry across the reborn earth. With the forest came new breath oxygen rising into the sky, feeding the cycles of atmosphere and climate. Clouds formed and broke in measured rhythm. Rain fell in patterns that nurtured rather than destroyed. Lightning flashed across distant horizons, igniting fires that cleared space for further growth. From destruction came renewal, from stillness, motion. The oceans mirrored the transformation. Plankton blooms turned the waters faintly turquoise. Fish-like forms evolved from simple swimmers into more complex hunters and grazers. The seafloor became a tapestry of coral and sediment, teeming with small invertebrates. Each generation of life built upon the bones of the one before it, shaping the future with the quiet certainty of persistence. Time moved beyond comprehension. Thousands of years became millions, each moment insignificant on its own, yet monumental in accumulation. Continents shifted imperceptibly, their slow drift carving new coastlines and raising new mountain chains. Rivers that had once flowed westward turned south. Valleys deepened, lakes formed and vanished. The memory of the cataclysm faded into the geology of the world, written in stone rather than in the living. New creatures emerged, their forms small but intricate. Reptiles gave way to early mammals, tiny, warm-blooded beings that crept through the underbrush and burrowed in the soil. Their senses were sharp, their habits cautious, their lives brief but fertile. They lived not in dominance but in harmony with the cycles of the recovering world. Their presence was subtle, yet their adaptability hinted at futures the Earth itself could not yet imagine. bird-like forms descended from the last of the feathered predators took to the air. Their wings beat softly against the thinning clouds, their cries echoing over the forests and rivers below. They were lighter, quicker, more precise creatures of motion and balance, masters of the space once dominated by giants. The sky, empty for so long, now moved again with life. In this new equilibrium, the Earth seemed younger, its surfaces smooth with renewal. The scars of the past were softened by growth, though never entirely erased. Beneath the roots of forests, bones of ancient creatures lay preserved, vast and silent, their forms fossilized into the architecture of memory. Each layer of soil, each vein of stone carried traces of what had come before, reminders that creation and extinction were not opposites but phases of the same eternal rhythm. As ages unfolded, the planet warmed, ice receded from the poles, vegetation spread into new territories. The cycles of the atmosphere stabilized further, and the light deepened into a golden hue that nourished the returning abundance. Rainforests expanded where once there had been wasteland. Insects thrived, their numbers uncountable, and their movements pollinated the reborn flora. The song of life, once silenced, now filled the air again, subtle, layered, infinite. There was no observer to mark this rebirth, no witness to chronicle the passage from ruin to renewal. The Earth moved in silence, indifferent yet magnificent, its vitality inherent and self-contained. The fossils of giants slept beneath layers of sediment, their forms pressed into stone monuments not of loss, but of continuity. Each grain of sand, each drop of rain, each leaf unfurling beneath the sun bore the memory of all that had come before. And so the planet turned, slow and patient, beneath a sky that now shone clear and blue. The age of giants had ended, but in their absence, life had learned to adapt, to grow small, to persist through fragility. In that humility lay its strength. The world that emerged from the darkness was not a return to what had been, but the creation of something entirely new, softer, quieter, yet no less miraculous. The echoes of the lost giants lingered still, carried in the bones of the earth and the breath of the wind, a reminder that even in destruction there is the promise of renewal. The dawn after silence had arrived. The long night was over. The world had grown lush again. Where once the ground had been pale and silent, a living tapestry now spread outward in every direction, a dense weave of forest, fern, and flowing water. Rivers coursed freely, carving winding paths through valleys heavy with vegetation. The air was thick with scent and motion, warm currents carrying the hum of insects and the rustle of countless leaves. Light filtered softly through canopies of green, painting the earth in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. The age of stillness had long passed. Life, cautious at first, now flourished in grand profusion. In the lowlands, forests unfurled like great green seas. Towering trees rose from damp soil, their trunks wrapped in moss and lichen, their crowns intertwined above. Vines cascaded from branch to branch, forming bridges for small creatures that leapt and glided through the air. Ferns unfurled in endless repetition, their fronds catching the dew that shimmered like silver in the morning haze. The ground itself pulsed with vitality roots, pushing through layers of ancient ash, fungi spreading unseen through the dark richness beneath. Everywhere there was sound, the rhythmic drumming of rain on leaves, the constant murmur of streams, the distant cries of unseen birds. The air vibrated with life, its density filled by wings, by motion, by breath. Small mammals scurried among the underbrush, their bodies sleek and warm, their movements quick and purposeful. They gnawed at seeds and fruits, carried spores on their fur, and became, unknowingly, agents of the forest's expansion. The climate had stabilized into a gentle warmth, punctuated by seasonal rains and long, tranquil summers. Clouds gathered in slow procession over mountain ranges, releasing rain that renewed the cycle of growth below. The great rivers, now deep and steady, carried sediment from the highlands to the seas, enriching the plains with new life. The land and sky had found their rhythm again, a quiet balance that breathed creation. Among the branches, the descendants of ancient reptiles had transformed. Their scales had given way to feathers that shimmered in the sunlight with colours unseen in the age before. Wings spread wide, catching the warm currents that rose from the forest floor. They soared, glided, and dove through the layers of air, their movements effortless and precise. Their songs complex and varied, wove together into the new music of the world, a living counterpoint to the silence that had once reigned. Beneath them, mammals grew bolder. Some remained small, darting through tunnels and roots, their bodies built for secrecy and speed. Others grew larger, emerging into the open glades to graze on the abundance of green. Their forms were unfamiliar, long-limbed and heavy-furred, their eyes bright with awareness. Herds moved across the plains, guided not by memory, but by instinct shaped anew. Their young stumbled beside them, learning the rhythm of movement, the patterns of survival, the quiet trust of belonging to a group. Predators followed, as they always had. Sleek and silent, they moved with purpose through the tall grass and dense foliage. Their senses were sharp, their movements fluid. Some hunted alone, others in small bands, guided by scent and sound. The balance of the world had reasserted itself. Creation and consumption in perfect tension, life feeding on life in the endless dance of renewal. In the highlands, forests gave way to open meadows, where wildflowers painted the slopes with colour. The air there was thin and clear, carrying the scent of resin and stone. Insects swarmed above the blossoms, their wings catching the sun like fragments of glass. Small animals followed their paths, feeding on nectar, pollen, and one another. Each creature, each motion, contributed to the great interwoven order of existence. Time flowed in slow abundance. Seasons rose and fell like the breathing of the planet itself. Rain nourished the rivers, rivers fed the seas, and from the seas came mist that returned to the sky. Trees grew, died, and fed the soil. Creatures were born, lived, and returned their substance to the world. Nothing was wasted. Even decay had its purpose, its quiet contribution to the cycles that governed everything that lived. The oceans mirrored this prosperity. Coral reefs returned in vast expanses, glowing with colour beneath the clear blue water. Shoals of fish darted through the coral labyrinths in synchronized brilliance, flashing silver and gold as they turned. Larger creatures, descendants of the ancient reptiles of the sea, glided through the depths, their forms sleek and graceful. Life in the oceans had become as rich as that on land, a mirror of movement and form, each realm feeding and reflecting the other. From the coasts, new kinds of beings ventured onto the shore. Amphibians that once hid in the mud began to explore further inland, their limbs stronger, their lungs more capable. They became the pioneers of transition, linking water and land in a continuous circuit of adaptation. Each new form was an experiment, each change a whisper of a civolution working quietly and endlessly beneath the surface of time. Forests spread to the edges of continents, their canopies merging into near-endless expanses of green. From above, the earth appeared like a single living organism, breathing through the rhythm of its trees, pulsing with the movement of water and wind. Mountains, rivers, and valleys all played their part in this vast composition, a symphony of matter transformed by light and time. Lightning storms swept across the plains in summer, igniting fires that roared through the underbrush and cleared space for renewal. In their wake, seeds germinated in ash-rich soil, sprouting faster and stronger than before. This cycle of destruction and creation had not vanished. It had simply found a gentler cadence. Fire was no longer an end, but a pulse in the heart of life's persistence. The bones of the giants still slept beneath the surface, entombed in rock and memory. They had become part of the foundation, their mineralized forms blending with the earth they had once roamed. Occasionally, floods or erosion exposed fragments, great ribs emerging from a riverbank, a curved tooth glinting in the sunlight. To the creatures of this new age, they were nothing but shapes in stone, relics without meaning. Yet the earth remembered. Each layer of sediment carried the imprint of the ages, each fossil a verse in the poem of existence. In the cool shadows of the forest floor, new intelligence flickered. The small mammals that had once hidden now began to explore, to test, to learn. Their paws turned objects, their eyes followed patterns, their minds began to trace cause and consequence. They built small shelters of leaves, stored food for leaner times, and taught their young through mimicry and instinct. The slow ascent of thought had begun, not as dominance, but as curiosity, the quiet stirring of awareness in the stillness of plenty. The world's colours deepened with time. The greens of the forest darkened, the blues of the oceans grew richer, the skies turned a deeper hue of gold at dusk. Even the air seemed to shimmer with vitality, filled with the collective breath of countless living things. Clouds drifted lazily across the horizon, their shapes mirrored in lakes and rivers below. The light of the sun, steady and gentle, washed over all things equally, carrying no judgment, only continuity. From the vantage of eternity, this was the Green Empire, the flourishing of life reborn from ruin, the living testament to the planet's capacity for renewal. No ruler presided over it, no consciousness guided its expansion. It was life for its own sake, growth without ambition, balance without reason, beauty without witness, and yet, within it, the seeds of future complexity already stirred, the patterns of flight, of thought, of cooperation, all lay waiting in the quiet pulse of existence. The earth, ever patient, turned once more beneath the endless sky. Its forests whispered with wind, its rivers shimmered with light, its creatures moved through the rhythm of survival and grace. The echoes of the lost giants were no longer sorrowful. They had become part of the song itself, woven into the roots and rivers, the breath of leaves and the bones of mountains. The Green Empire stretched from horizon to horizon, vast and unbroken, a living monument to endurance. In the quiet of dusk, when the air grew still and the light softened to amber, the world seemed to pause, not in fear or in mourning, but in peace. The long arc of time had bent once again toward life, and life, humble and magnificent, had answered. The age of stillness began to waver. Beneath the calm breath of forests and the steady rhythm of the seas, something imperceptible stirred. Deep within the earth, the old continents shifted once more, their titanic plates grinding, bending and drifting apart in slow, unending motion. Mountains rose and were worn down again, valleys filled with rivers, then dried to dust. What had seemed eternal began to move. The winds themselves changed, whispering new patterns through the leaves, carrying the scent of distant storms. The world's surface, once blanketed in an unbroken sea of green, began to fragment into zones of contrast. Where humid forests had ruled, dryness crept in, first as a subtle thinning of canopy, then as vast open spaces of grass and scrub. The air grew lighter, the sky broader, and the sun more commanding. Rivers still flowed, but they meandered through landscapes that had begun to crack with heat. In the north, cold winds gathered strength, shaping the first long winters known to the reborn earth. In these shifting lands, life adapted as it always had. The creatures that once knew only shadow and dampness now ventured into open plains, their bodies changing to meet the needs of new environments. Limbs lengthened, lungs grew larger, and endurance became as valuable as stealth. The world was preparing for motion for migrations that would span hundreds of generations. Across the plains, herds of mammals moved like dark tides. Their hooves struck the ground in rhythms that echoed the deep pulse of the planet itself. Some bore antlers, others tusks. Their bodies were thick with fur against the gathering chill. Calves followed mothers through the windswept grasses, guided by instinct older than memory. Predators watched from the ridgelines, silent, patient, their eyes gleaming amber in the dusk. The balance between pursuit and survival held steady, though the shapes of both hunter and hunted had begun to shift. Among the new rulers of the land were the great cats of the age's dawn, creatures of power and grace, built for endurance rather than the explosive violence of the reptiles before them. Their paws pressed softly into the earth, leaving only faint impressions that the next rain would erase. They hunted by scent and silence, by the faint tremor of movement in the grass. When they struck, it was with precision, not chaos. The violence of the past had softened into necessity, tempered by the rhythm of time. Birds, the last heirs of the air, multiplied in variety and form. Some soared over the savannas, their shadows crossing the herds below. Others filled the forests that still clung to the wetter valleys. Their feathers had grown more intricate, their calls more varied. They became the world's storytellers, carrying the songs of each region on the changing winds. With every migration, they traced invisible paths across continents, connecting coast to coast, mountain to sea. The seas themselves were changing. The ancient currents shifted course as continents moved apart, altering climates far inland. New archipelagos emerged from the deep, their volcanic hearts still smoking, their shores ringed by fresh coral and black sand. Life colonized them swiftly, ferns sprouting between cracks, insects blown in by storm, small reptiles crawling from driftwood washed ashore. In the shallows, marine mammals began to appear, descendants of land dwellers that had returned to the water's embrace. Their sleek forms glided through the waves, breathing air but living in the deep. The skies grew restless. Storms intensified, crossing greater distances, carrying rain to deserts and salt to forests. The wind carved the mountains into sharper relief, whistling through canyons and sweeping across plains. Dust travelled far grains of one continent settling on another, carrying with them the seeds of new growth. The planet had become a single living body, its parts no longer isolated but bound by air, by water, by motion. In the midst of this restlessness, the forests still stood, though they were no longer the endless empires of the past. They retreated to valleys and riverbanks, their green depths now bordered by expanses of open land. Within these sanctuaries, the ancient rhythm persisted. Amphibians croaked in the dusk, insects traced patterns of light above pools of water, vines wrapped themselves around fallen trunks and reached toward the filtered sun. But even here, change was constant. New plants rose grasses with narrow blades and deep roots, capable of surviving both drought and flood. They began their quiet conquest, spreading unseen until the land was theirs. From the highlands, cold winds descended each season, turning the lakes to glass and driving animals southward. The first migrations took shape, not just of birds but of entire populations of grazing beasts, moving in slow procession across the plains. They followed the scent of rain, the promise of tender shoots, the echo of survival embedded in their blood. The predators followed, keeping their distance until hunger drew them close. The cycle extended now across thousands of miles, life unfolding not in stillness but in motion. The air carried new scents: resin, dust, frost, and distant smoke. Fire had returned, but not as destruction. It cleansed the old grass, released seeds from their husks, and made way for renewal. After each blaze, the land erupted in green again, brighter and stronger. The creatures learned to move with the fires, to wait at their edges until the smoke cleared. What once had been terror became rhythm, an understanding between the living world and the forces that shaped it. In some regions, the sky began to dim with ash not from chaos, but from the quiet, steady pulse of volcanoes that marked the boundaries of new continents. The eruptions brought warmth and minerals to the air, altering weather, feeding the soil. Rains fell darker, heavier, scented with the breath of the deep earth. The rivers carried this new fertility to the plains, where grasses and forests drank it greedily. Life responded not with fear, but with abundance. Beneath the earth, fossils of the old world turned slowly to stone. The bones of the titans, the long-necked wanderers, the scaled predators, the armoured giants lay deep within strata that the rains no longer reached. They were part of the foundation now, silent witnesses to the continuity of existence. Occasionally, the shifting ground exposed them, letting the wind trace their forms once more before burying them again in sand and time. The skies grew broader as the air thinned. The sunsets became vast displays of colour: scarlet, violet, and gold. At twilight, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cries of night birds echoed across the plains, answered by the distant roars of unseen beasts. The stars appeared one by one, reflections of the deep fires still moving within the planet. The constellations changed subtly as continents drifted beneath them, but the eternal rhythm of rise and fall, of dusk and dawn, remained unbroken. In the north, glaciers began to grow, slowly, silently, their edges advancing with patience beyond measure. They carved valleys as they moved, leaving behind lakes and cliffs, reshaping the face of the land. Forests bowed before them, retreating step by step. Animals followed, their migrations lengthening each season. Cold became a sculptor, chiseling the future into the present. Far to the south, warmth endured. Jungles remained vast and ancient, steaming beneath the rains. There, life multiplied without restraint. New forms of primates appeared, leaping through the canopy, their hands deft, their eyes forward. They had begun to think not as reasoning creatures, but as beings aware of space, of height, of choice. Their world was one of sound and motion, but within it flickered the first faint spark of curiosity. The seas mirrored these contrasts. In the cold waters near the poles, immense creatures thrived, whales with cavernous mouths that strained the plankton-rich currents. In the tropics, coral and fish bloomed in impossible colours. The planet's diversity had become its defining feature. Every region, every climate, every breath of wind carried a different song, yet all belonged to the same grand harmony. The old silence of the dinosaurs was long gone, but their memory lived in shape and gesture, in the wings of birds, in the scaled tails of reptiles, in the bones of every living creature. Evolution had not erased them. It had transformed them, folded them into the pattern of life's unbroken lineage. The winds that now crossed the world carried whispers of that legacy, a reminder that nothing truly ended, only changed form. The world was not calmer now, nor wilder. It was simply more intricate. Each mountain, each storm, each migration connected to countless others, forming a network of cause and consequence too vast for comprehension. The continents continued their drift. The seas carved new coastlines, and the sky shifted its currents. The age of giants had given way to an age of movement, of cycles, migrations, and invisible threads binding all living things. At dusk, the wind rose from the west, sweeping across the open plains. It carried with it the scent of grass, the dust of distant mountains, and the faint trace of salt from the faraway seas. The herds turned their heads to face it, their eyes calm, their forms outlined by the fading light. The world had grown immense, but it was no longer empty. Every shadow, every gust of air, every ripple on water was filled with memory. The winds of change continued their endless journey across the earth. They passed over deserts and forests, over ice and stone, touching every living thing with equal grace. They spoke of the past not as a warning, but as a promise that all things shift, that all life adapts, that time itself is only another form of wind. And as they blew, the world turned quietly beneath them, vast and alive, breathing in rhythm with the stars. The world had grown colder, imperceptibly at first, a subtle shift in the air that stirred leaves and bent branches. Seasons lengthened in the northern reaches, the warmth of summer retreating gradually, yielding to longer stretches of frost and shadow. Rivers slowed, and lakes became still mirrors of pale grey skies. Snow began to fall in fine, almost invisible threads, drifting downward on the wind, settling lightly upon the forests and plains. The whisper of ice had arrived, faint but insistent, carrying with it the promise of transformation. Mountains bore the earliest signs of glaciation. Their peaks, once jagged and bare, were capped with white. Valleys beneath held frozen rivers that crept downward imperceptibly, grinding stone with patience older than thought. The air above these nascent glaciers was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of mineral and frost, the faint hum of ice in motion. The winds that travelled from these heights were colder still, brushing across plains and forests, reshaping the patterns of leaves, seeds, and the paths of small creatures. In the forests of the Midlands, life adapted. Trees bent beneath snow, their branches shedding the weight in careful rhythm. Underbrush grew dense and protective, forming a labyrinth of shelter for small mammals that had learned to anticipate the cycles of cold and warmth. Insects burrowed beneath frozen soil, their dormant forms waiting for the first promise of thaw. The scent of damp earth mixed with resin and frost, a complex perfume of decay, survival, and endurance. Predators moved with new cunning. Large cats and their contemporaries stalked through snow-laden grasses, their padded feet leaving faint tracks in the whitened ground. They followed herds of grazing mammals, observing their rhythm with patience, calculating leaps and attacks with a precision honed by necessity. The cold sharpened senses, the faint rustle of fur, the subtle scent carried by the wind, the vibration of footsteps through frozen earth, all became instruments of survival. In the canopy above, birds navigated the shifting air currents. Some migrated south with the first snows, Others remained, their plumage thickened, their bodies compacted against frost. Their calls, once clear and melodic, now held a sharpness, a cadence born of caution. Yet even in their flight, there was a grace, a continuity. The wind carrying their presence across vast distances, threading connections between forests, rivers and mountains. Among the lowlands, the first signs of primates appeared. Small, agile, cautious, they explored the borders of forests and open plains. Their hands grasped branches and leaves with deliberation. Their eyes tracked movement, light and shadow. Even without language or concept, memory began to form, the recollection of where food could be found, where shelter might hide from predators, how the seasons shifted. Curiosity stirred within them, a faint spark mirrored in the cautious movements of their kin. The oceans reflected these changes in their own way. Glacial melt altered salinity and currents, reshaping coastlines and creating new estuaries and lagoons. Coastal ecosystems responded. Shellfish flourished in newly formed tidal pools, fish adjusted migrations to the pulse of the changing tides. Even the smallest plankton seemed to sense the rhythm of the earth, their blooms timed with subtle shifts in light, temperature, and wind. The vast living network of the planet adjusted quietly but inexorably. Across the plains, herds of grazing mammals felt the touch of frost. The grass, once abundant and soft, grew brittle. Seeds lay beneath snow, awaiting thaw. Young calves learned to step carefully on icy ground, following the instinctive paths of older members. Migration became necessary, the slow, deliberate movement across valleys and lowlands toward warmth and sustenance. Predators, attuned to these rhythms, followed silently, the frozen wind carrying their presence like a shadow across the land. In the highlands, glaciers advanced incrementally, their edges pressed into forests, carving new valleys and cliffs. Ice groaned and shifted, a deep resonant sound carried by the wind. The earth beneath it was reshaped, smoothing hills and creating basins for lakes yet to come. Even rivers, redirected by the movement of ice, became instruments of change, cutting new paths through sediment and stone. Life adapted or perished, following patterns invisible to the eye but inscribed into the rhythm of the planet. Small mammals and emerging primates discovered shelters among rocks and fallen trees. They learned to conserve warmth, huddling in groups, nesting in hollows lined with leaves and moss. Their movements were cautious. Each journey beyond shelter became a lesson in observation and memory. They noticed the smell of predators carried by wind, the pattern of snowfall across branches, the subtle shifts in temperature that signaled the arrival of winter. Survival became more than instinct. It became a record of experience, faint and fleeting, yet persistent. The wind carried sound across great distances. The cracking of ice in high mountains, the distant roar of falling glaciers, the rustle of trees bent under frost, all travelled like a language, unnoticed but understood by creatures that had learned to read the nuances of their environment. In this age, knowledge was sensory. The weight of snow, the vibration of ice, the faint scent of water under freezing soil. Memory was encoded not in words but in perception, guiding generations in ways both invisible and profound. Forests along river valleys remained havens. They sheltered life from extremes, offering food, moisture, and relative warmth. Trees adapted. Conifers grew thicker, shedding needles that insulated soil beneath. Ferns curled tighter, protecting delicate growth from frost. Streams beneath the ice continued to flow, their motion muffled but steady, feeding the roots and small creatures hidden in the underbrush. Even decay played a role. Leaves and animal remains enriched the soil, creating pockets of fertility amid the cold. Insects emerged with the warmth of intermittent sun. Their activity was brief but vital, pollinating the first early blooms, serving as food for fledgling birds, contributing to the cycle of life in tiny yet essential ways. They moved with an awareness of shadow and heat, timing their journeys to avoid freezing nights. Life in its smallest forms adapted with immediacy, thriving in gaps of opportunity provided by the shifting climate. The first large mammals learned to endure longer treks. Hooves pressed into frozen ground, fur thickened, fat stored in anticipation of scarcity. Herds moved in measured migration, guided by memory, scent, and the faint pulse of the wind. Predators tracked them, silent and calculating, as ice and snow added both challenge and opportunity. Each interaction, each survival, wove itself into the unfolding tapestry of evolution. Birds adapted as well. Some developed longer migrations, spanning the full reach of continents. Others specialized in winter survival, their feathers dense, their bodies compact. Flight became a test of endurance, navigation, and adaptation. Their songs, once melodic, carried now a quality of warning and awareness, teaching young and old alike through example and echo. In coastal regions, icebergs carved from glaciers, drifting into seas and altering currents. Marine life adapted. Seals and early whale-like creatures followed the shifting waters, learning where the cold brought nourishment and where warmth allowed respite. Fish and shellfish adjusted spawning cycles in response to the rhythms of ice, forming new ecological patterns that would persist for millennia. The whispers of ice carried memory. The wind moved over glaciers and plains, over rivers and forests, carrying the scent of survival and decay. In its passages, it touched every living creature with imperceptible guidance, shaping migrations, alerting to danger, marking the rhythm of seasons yet to unfold. The earth itself had become a vast ledger of experience, written in frost, in soil, in water, and in the breath of every creature. In sheltered forests, the primates grew bolder. Their hands traced bark and leaf, exploring textures, shapes, and patterns. Their eyes observed sequences, which branch bore fruit, which hollow held safety. Curiosity became a tool of survival, and memory a currency of life. They remembered paths, scents, and patterns of light and shade. In their small minds, the first glimmers of abstract recognition took root, a whisper of the intelligence that would one day rise to define the planet in new ways. Life moved in cycles, vast and interdependent. Glacial advance and retreat shaped rivers, valleys, and forests. Winds carried seeds, spores, and insects across vast distances. Predators honed senses attuned to ice, snow, and shadow. Prey learned rhythm, movement, and concealment. Birds, insects, and mammals created networks of interaction that transformed landscapes silently but irrevocably. Each generation remembered in instinct and practice, preserving knowledge across time. The nights were long and cold. Stars shone more clearly through thin, frozen air. In the silence, the planet whispered its history. Ice groaned. Rivers hummed beneath frozen surfaces, and winds traced lines across snowfields. Every sound was part of a pattern, a map of survival and endurance. Life, fragile yet persistent, followed the rhythms it had inherited, learning to read the signs written in frost and stone. Through this era of whispering ice, the world continued its patient motion. Continents drifted, glaciers carved and receded, climates oscillated. Forests adapted, plains endured, rivers shifted. Small creatures navigated with memory and instinct. Large mammals roamed with endurance. Birds and insects carried life across distances unimaginable. The planet had entered a new chapter, not one of dominance or catastrophe, but of subtlety, endurance, and adaptation. The echoes of giants lingered, folded into the landscape and the wind. Memory persisted, not in conscious thought, but in rhythm, pattern, and survival. The ice whispered these lessons endlessly, touching all that lived, teaching the quiet art of observation, adaptation, and endurance. And so the world turned, slow, patient, inexorable, beneath the icy sky. Life endured, adapted, and moved forward, carrying within it the legacy of ages long past and the faint, persistent promise of the futures yet to come. The ice pressed steadily from the highlands, relentless yet patient. Valleys once carved by rivers of warmth now held glaciers that crept imperceptibly downward, shaping the landscape with silent authority. Each advance was measured, deliberate, a slow sculpting of stone and soil that would endure for millennia. The wind carried the cry of cold across plains and forests, its voice sharp against the muted rustle of snow-laden branches and the muffled steps of cautious creatures. Rivers, diverted and restrained by the movement of ice, became slender threads through frozen land. They trickled beneath glaciers in hidden channels, resurfacing in valleys as clear, biting streams. Their waters, once warm and abundant, carried sediments newly ground by grinding ice, enriching distant plains in subtle ways. Along their edges, moss and lichen thrived in sheltered crevices, the first green against a world mostly white and grey. The forests, where they endured, had adapted to the relentless cold. Conifers stood firm, their thick needles resisting frost. Ferns curled tightly at the base of trunks, sheltering insects and small mammals beneath their fronds. Fallen leaves and decaying wood created pockets of warmth, sustaining life through the long, biting winters. Every layer of soil, every crevice, became a microcosm of resilience. In these forests, the first forms of social learning emerged among small primates. They shared paths of travel, nesting sites, and sources of food, guiding the young through dangers visible and hidden. Observation became a cornerstone of survival. Which tree bore edible fruit, which hollow remained dry under snow, which predator's approach could be felt through subtle vibrations in the frozen earth. Memory, instinct, and cautious curiosity intertwined, creating a delicate network of knowledge transmitted silently across generations. The plains, in contrast, were harsh and exposed. Herds of grazing mammals moved slowly across the snow, hooves crunching against frozen soil. Their fur thickened against the cold, fat stored beneath skin as insulation. They followed instinct and memory, guided by subtle changes in wind, the faint scent of vegetation beneath ice, and the distant rumble of predators. Large cats and other hunters adapted, moving with silent, calculated patience, their presence often detected only by the faint tremor of snow disturbed in their passage. The oceans reflected this frozen world in motion. Currents shifted as glaciers melted and reformed, altering salinity and temperature. Cold water swept along coasts, driving schools of fish toward warmer regions, while plankton blooms followed subtle cues in light and nutrient flow. Marine mammals navigated these currents, learning routes, timing their births to coincide with abundant feeding, and adjusting their migrations as the ice pressed farther into the seas. Even the smallest creatures, carried by tides and currents, played their role in a grand, interconnected pattern that was both invisible and indispensable. The wind became a carrier of stories. It swept across ice fields and forests, over rivers and plains, carrying the scent of predators, the faint warmth of distant water, the subtleties of the seasons. Life learned to read these invisible signals. A shift in direction might presage a storm. A change in scent might reveal the approach of a predator or the presence of food. The planet's rhythms were recorded not in stone alone, but in movement, in vibration, and in the instincts of every living creature. Birds navigated these currents with growing skill. Some took long migrations, tracing invisible paths across continents. Others adapted to winter, their plumage thickened, their movements economical, their calls carrying the awareness of danger and survival. Flocks followed thermal currents, riding the air with effortless grace, and nested in valleys and cliffs where shelter and food aligned. Their presence tied distant regions together, linking ecosystems through motion and observation. Glaciers continued their patient work, carving deep valleys and widening riverbeds. As ice retreated and returned, new habitats emerged. Lakes formed behind natural dams of moraine, then overflowed into streams that spread fertility across plains and forests. Sediments enriched soils far beyond the reach of immediate rivers, seeding life in unseen corners. The slow pulse of glacial advance and retreat orchestrated the distribution of resources, shaping the movement of animals and the cycles of plants with imperceptible authority. The first large mammals adapted to this new rhythm. Some became herd dwellers, moving collectively for warmth and protection, while others specialized in solitude and stealth. Their senses sharpened, eyes adjusted to the low winter light, ears detected the faintest sounds beneath snow, noses read the subtlest scents carried on cold winds. Life in the frozen world demanded precision, endurance, and intelligence born of observation and experience. Primates learned to manipulate their environment more deliberately. They used stones to break nuts, shifted branches to access fruit, and sought the warmth of sunlit rocks during cold spells. Observation of their kin became a foundation of survival, as actions were mimicked and remembered. teaching the young the lessons necessary to endure both cold and predator. Social bonds, fragile but persistent, began to emerge, offering protection, guidance, and the rudimentary beginnings of cooperative strategy. Storms swept across the continent with relentless energy. Snow and sleet reshaped the land, covering valleys, altering river courses, and breaking branches. Lightning struck distant peaks, igniting rare blazes that cleared dead wood and made room for future growth. Life moved around these disruptions, learning not through understanding but through instinct and experience. Each event was absorbed into memory, informing the choices of future generations in ways both subtle and profound. The oceans too responded to the frozen world. Icebergs drifted from polar glaciers, altering currents and tides. Coastal waters became arenas of constant adjustment. Marine mammals shifted feeding grounds, fish changed routes, plankton adapted to the cold pulses of light and nutrient flow. Each organism, from the smallest to the largest, became part of a choreography dictated by ice, wind, and current, an intricate ballet that carried echoes of survival and adaptation across vast distances. Forests along glacial margins became sanctuaries. Within their shadows, life endured the extremes. Insects emerged briefly during thaws, pollinating hardy plants. Birds nested among evergreen branches. Small mammals nested in burrows lined with leaves, moss, and frost-resistant material. Microclimates persisted in hollows and caves, creating pockets where life could find continuity despite the broader harshness. Even the decay of fallen branches and leaves contributed, enriching the soil, seeding the next generation of green. Rivers, newly carved or redirected by ice, became lifelines. They carried meltwater to distant plains, nourishing the sparse grass and ferns that could endure the cold. Along their banks, life clustered. Amphibians that had returned to water during cold periods, small mammals that depended on aquatic insects, and birds that followed currents in search of food. Movement along these arteries became essential, and creatures that adapted to their rhythm thrived, while others receded into obscurity. The wind carried more than scent, it carried memory. Shifts in direction presaged storms. The subtle vibration of frozen soil warned of predators. The faint scent of plants beneath snow guided movements across vast distances. Life learned to read these signals, incorporating them into instinct, shaping behavior, and teaching young in ways that left no trace but the continuation of survival. Large mammals moved with growing intelligence. Herds adjusted their migration routes, choosing paths that balanced safety and sustenance. Predators refined their stalking strategies, learning to anticipate herd patterns, timing attacks with patience measured in hours or days. The frozen currents shaped the choreography of life, each movement a response to ice, wind, and snow. The first social bonds among primates strengthened. Groups shared shelter, food, and observation. Patterns of communication emerged, subtle gestures and calls that indicated danger, opportunity, or guidance. Memory became collective, recorded not in stone or leaf, but in behavior transmitted across generations. Intelligence flickered, faint but persistent, a subtle thread in the tapestry of the frozen world. The skies reflected the planet's rhythm. Clouds drifted across pale light, snow fell silently, and winds carried change across valleys and plains. The aurora touched high latitudes with ephemeral colour, and stars gleamed with clarity over frozen landscapes. All movement, ice, wind, water, and living creatures was part of a single, ongoing symphony, a record of time and endurance written in motion, sound, and instinct. The frozen currents shaped every interaction, every survival, every moment of life. Ice carved the valleys, winds carried knowledge, rivers supplied sustenance, and creatures adapted with patience and persistence. Memory, observation, and instinct combined to sustain existence in a world both harsh and magnificent. Life endured. It adapted. It observed. It moved. Across glaciers and forests, rivers and plains, the patterns of survival wove an intricate, invisible web connecting every living thing. The planet turned beneath the frozen sky, its rhythms imperceptible yet absolute, carrying the echoes of giants, the whispers of wind, and the quiet persistence of life into an unfolding future. The world had settled into rhythms older than memory. Glaciers pressed steadily from the highlands, their edges grinding stone into valleys that deepened with patient insistence. Rivers, born from melting ice, carved intricate channels across the plains, feeding streams and lakes that shimmered beneath pale skies. The wind, ever a restless sculptor, carried the scent of snow and stone, of resin and river, weaving subtle connections between distant forests and highlands. Life moved within this frame, measured and deliberate, responding to the pulse of ice, water, and air. In the valleys, forests adjusted to the changing contours of the land. Conifers and hardy deciduous trees clung to riverbanks and slopes, their roots entwined with rocks and soil, resisting erosion. Fallen branches and decaying leaves enriched the ground, sustaining the insects and small mammals that depended on them. Streams that meandered through moss-covered stones provided nourishment and shelter, a steady rhythm amid the broader dynamism of glaciers and winds. Large mammals migrated through these deep valleys, their movements coordinated by instinct and observation. Herds followed subtle inclines, crossing frozen tributaries, halting where ice threatened to break beneath their weight. Young calves learned the patterns of terrain from the elders, guided by scent, sound, and the faint vibrations transmitted through snow and soil. Predators followed quietly, calculating steps, balancing the hunt with the economy of effort demanded by the harsh, yet abundant landscape. Social bonds among primates and mammals deepened. Groups travelled together, sharing warmth in huddles, communicating through gestures and calls imperceptible to those outside their kin. Young learned not only from instinct but from the observation of others, where to forage, how to sense predators, when to move, when to pause. These networks of learning expanded survival, creating resilience in a world that demanded both adaptation and coordination. Birds carved the skies above. Some migrated long distances, tracing invisible corridors of wind and thermal currents. Others remained within valleys, finding shelter among cliffs and trees, their calls carrying warnings, guidance, and signals of food. Flight became both an instrument of exploration and a mechanism of survival, their shadows crossing valleys like fleeting brushstrokes of motion and life. Glacial activity reshaped the valleys gradually. Ice sheets carved terraces and basins, leaving lakes where none had existed before. Sediment-laden meltwater enriched the soils, supporting the emergence of new plants and expanding the range of existing species. Life responded to these subtle shifts, colonizing fresh ground, tracing the contours of watercourses, and adapting to microclimates created by sun, shadow, and ice. Predators adapted their strategies. In the open plains of the valleys, stalking became coordinated. Wolves-like packs emerged, following herds along predictable paths, hunting with patience and precision. Birds of prey observed from heights, diving to snatch small mammals or fish from icy streams. Each species, in its own rhythm, became part of a complex web of life, balanced between pursuit and evasion, predation and survival. Rivers became the lifelines of the valleys. Their waters carried nutrients, seeds, and small creatures across landscapes, connecting highlands to lowlands, forests to plains, lakes to streams. Aquatic life adjusted, fish adapting to cold pulses, amphibians seeking refuge beneath ice and moss, insects emerging briefly to pollinate hardy plants. Even ephemeral creatures contributed to the slow architecture of ecosystems, shaping patterns that would endure for centuries. The ice itself told stories. Glaciers groaned as they shifted, grinding stone and soil into new forms. Avalanches and icefalls reshaped cliffs and ridges. The frozen currents carried minerals to the valleys below, their subtle deposits fostering growth where few seeds could survive. In this landscape, endurance and observation were as vital as strength or speed. Life moved in measured cycles, synchronized with the slow rhythm of the glaciers and the wind. Small mammals flourished in microhabitats. Burrows lined with leaves, moss and snow provided insulation against cold. Observation and imitation guided young animals as they learned to navigate complex terrain, forage for scarce resources, and anticipate the movements of predators. Memory became a living record, embedded in behavior and reinforced across generations. Survival was not merely instinctive, it was informed by experience. Primates explored the edges of rivers and streams. Hands traced the textures of bark, stone, and water, learning sequences, timing, and cause and effect. Groups cooperated to access food or defend against predators, their social structures expanding in complexity. Observation, imitation, and communication became essential tools. In this cold, moving world, the spark of awareness flickered stronger, laying the foundation for intelligence that would one day define distant ages. The valleys themselves became stages of life's unfolding choreography. Predators and prey moved along intertwined paths, each responding to subtle cues of wind, scent, and sound. Birds and insects linked distant regions through motion and pollination. Aquatic species traced currents in rivers and lakes, connecting ecosystems with invisible threads. The planet's rhythm, slow and imperceptible, orchestrated survival with timeless precision. Storms swept occasionally across the valleys. Snow fell in sheets, wind tore through forests, ice cracked and shifted. Life responded with patience. Herds sought shelter along riverbanks. Predators waited silently for opportunities. Birds took refuge in cliffs or dense canopy. The lessons of survival were encoded in behavior, passed along through generations, unrecorded yet enduring. In warmer pockets, vegetation thrived. Grasses, mosses, and small shrubs expanded during summer, providing sustenance for migrating herbivores. Insects and birds exploited this abundance, completing cycles of pollination and predation. Microhabitats, subtle in scale but critical in function, created a mosaic of life that balanced extremes of cold and warmth. The ice's retreat and advance dictated patterns of growth and decay. Lakes and streams appeared where ice once pressed, then vanished beneath returning glaciers. Rivers carved new paths, reshaping soil and terrain. Vegetation responded to moisture, sun, and frost. Animals followed, adapting routes, timing, and social strategies to the cadence of ice and water. Each element influenced the other, a delicate equilibrium forming in response to the frozen currents. Over generations, life became more integrated. Herds coordinated movements, predators refined stalking techniques, birds mapped territories and feeding grounds, primates refined cooperative behavior. Complex interactions emerged, establishing early forms of ecological networks. Knowledge was transmitted not in language but in observation, imitation, and shared experience, a silent inheritance guiding survival in a world of change. Glaciers carved deep valleys that became permanent features of the landscape. Rivers flowed with steady purpose, lakes collected glacial melt, and forests adapted to terraces and slopes. Life navigated these structures, moving with both instinct and learned behavior. The patterns of survival traced the contours of the land, intertwining climate, geology, and biology into intricate ecosystems. The frozen currents carried whispers of the past. Ice remembered the titans that had walked the earth, bones pressed into rock, shaping soil and stone. Rivers traced paths first trodden by long-extinct mammals, now mirrored by the movements of new species. Wind carried the memory of forests, plains, and coasts, imparting subtle lessons to creatures attuned to its message. As the valleys deepened, life persisted. Herbivores grazed, predators hunted, birds nested, and small mammals burrowed. Primates observed, imitated, and learned, building the earliest frameworks of social cooperation. Insects pollinated, fish swam, amphibians thrived, each being contributed to the emergent complexity of ecosystems, responding to glacial cycles, river flows, and wind patterns. The seasons passed in rhythm with ice and wind. Spring thaw revealed rivers and valleys, summer nurtured growth, autumn prepared the land and its creatures for the long winter. Winter pressed with snow, ice, and cold winds. Life endured, adapted, and responded. Each generation inherited knowledge from the last, whether through instinct, imitation, or observation. The deep valleys became both sanctuary and stage. Within their contours, the first intricate webs of life solidified. Cooperation, memory, endurance, and adaptation intertwined. Predation balanced survival, migration balanced resources, observation guided the young, cycles of cold and warmth sculpted behavior. Life had learned to read the rhythms of the frozen currents, to move in harmony with the planet's slow pulse. The ice, wind, water, and living creatures together composed the final symphony of an era. The echoes of giants persisted, folded into stone, river and soil, guiding new forms of life silently through adaptation and memory. The green of forests, the white of glaciers, and the flowing silver of rivers interwove with the movement of mammals, birds and insects, shaping the complex dance of survival. In the quiet of dusk, the valleys seemed to breathe. Snow drifted, rivers shimmered beneath thinning ice, birds returned to trees, herds settled for the night, and primates huddled together for warmth. The world, patient and enduring, turned beneath the sky. Its rhythms were subtle but absolute. Life, resilient and adaptive, persisted, ever learning, ever observing, ever enduring. The frozen currents carved their legacy into the earth. Valleys deepened, rivers meandered, ecosystems intertwined. Memory, observation, and cooperation ensured survival. The giants were gone, yet their echoes remained in bones, in soil, in wind, and in the behaviours of the living. The planet had reached a new equilibrium, where the cycles of ice, water, wind, and life flowed in measured harmony, an enduring testament to persistence, adaptation, and the quiet majesty of existence. And so, beneath the vast sky, amidst glaciers and rivers, forests and plains, the world continued its patient motion. Life endured, complex and intertwined, carrying forward the memory of all that had come before and the promise of futures yet to unfold.